For 10 years, Alara lived as a ghost in her own pack, a wolfless Omega scrubbing floors and dodging blows. She carried a secret that would either burn the world down or put a target on her back. She wasn't broken. She was the Silver Wolf, a celestial myth thought to be extinct. But when Alpha King Draven, the executioner of crowns, arrives at her borders demanding a mate, he doesn't look for a queen. He looks for a scent. And he won't stop until he forces the beast behind her blue eyes to roar. Chapter 1. The Omega's Mask. The cold was the only thing that felt real anymore. It seeped through the cracks in the floorboards of the attic, a thin, biting wind that smelled of damp pine and the encroaching winter. Alara lay still, her breath blooming in small, ghostly clouds before her face. In the distance, the first howl of the morning broke the silence, a jagged, mournful sound that signaled the changing of the guard at the Shadow Creek perimeter. She didn't move. She couldn't afford to be eager. Eagerness was a trait of the young, the hopeful, and the wolves who actually had a place in this world. Alara was none of those things. To the Shadow Creek pack, she was simply the ghost, the girl who had failed to shift on her 16th birthday and had spent the last decade scrubbing the sins of her betters off the floor. With a groan that mirrored the creak of the old house, she pushed herself up. Her muscles felt like rusted iron, stiff and protesting. She reached under the thin pallet that served as her bed and pulled out a small leather pouch. Inside was a dried, grayish root aconite, monkshood. To most werewolves, it was a slow-acting poison, a substance that dampened the spirit and weakened the body. To Alara, it was her lifeline. She placed a small shard of the root on her tongue. The bitterness was immediate, a sharp, metallic tang that made her eyes water and her throat constrict. She swallowed hard, feeling the familiar, cold numbness spread through her veins. "Hush, Luna, asterisk," she whispered into the dark corners of her own mind. Deep within her, behind a wall of mental scarring and chemical suppression, something stirred. It wasn't a growl, it was a hum. A vibration of pure, celestial silver that threatened to shatter her ribs every time it moved. Her wolf, Luna, was not a creature of fur and claw. She was a supernova trapped in a cage of flesh. For 10 years, Alara had fed that supernova poison to keep the light from leaking out. "Alara, get your useless pelt down here. The floors won't scrub themselves, and the king doesn't wait for Omegas." The voice of Beta Martha thundered through the vents, dripping with the casual cruelty that had become Alara's daily bread. Today was the day. The day the atmosphere in the pack had turned from its usual stagnant tension to a fever pitch of terror and excitement. Alpha King Draven was coming. He wasn't just a king, he was a myth carved out of obsidian and spilled blood. They called him the Asterisk Executioner of Crown's Asterisk. Rumor had it he had slaughtered his own father to take the throne at 19, and that his wolf, Nero, was so large he could snap a grizzly's spine with a single paw. He was traveling the northern territories, supposedly to inspect the borders, but everyone knew the real reason. He was looking for something, or someone. Alara pulled on her tattered gray tunic, the fabric so thin it did nothing to hide the prominence of her collarbones. She looked in the shattered fragment of a mirror propped against the wall. Her eyes were a dull, muddy brown, the result of the aconite. Only she knew that underneath the chemical haze, they were the color of a winter moon, glowing with a light that didn't belong to this earth. She descended the narrow stairs, keeping her head low. The pack house was already a hive of frantic activity. High-ranking females were draped in silks they couldn't afford, their scents, lavender, musk, vanilla, cloying and desperate in the air. They were all hopping to catch the king's eye. They wanted to be his queen, unaware that Draven was rumored to have a heart made of frostbite. "There you are," Martha hissed as Alara reached the kitchen. The beta female didn't even look at her, instead shoving a heavy bucket of lye and a stiff brush into her hands. "The great hall must shine. If the king sees so much as a speck of dust, I'll make sure you spend the next week in the silver-lined cells. Do you understand?" "Yes, Beta," Alara whispered. Her voice was thin, unused. "Don't speak to me, just work, and stay out of sight. I don't want His Majesty seeing the trash we keep in the attic." Alara moved to the great hall, a massive room of dark oak and stone. As she dropped to her knees and began the rhythmic, soul-crushing work of scrubbing, she allowed her mind to drift back. Back to the night the fires took her family. Back to the smell of burning cedar and the way her father had screamed for her to hide her light. "They will hunt you, Alara," he had gasped, his blood staining her small hands. "The silver wolf is a prize the alphas will tear the world apart to own. You must be nothing. You must be a shadow." She had been a good daughter. She had been nothing for a decade. But as the morning sun hit the floorboards, a sudden, violent shiver raced down her spine. It wasn't from the cold. It was a pressure in the air, a shift in the barometric weight of the room. The other wolves in the house suddenly went silent. The giggling of the young females stopped. The barking orders of the warriors ceased. Outside, the sound of heavy tires on gravel crunched like breaking bones. Then came the scent. It hit Alara like a physical blow, bypassing the aconite numbness and slamming straight into her dormant heart. It was the smell of a thunderstorm over a cedar forest, sharp, ozone-heavy, and devastatingly masculine. It was power. It was ancient. The heavy oak doors of the great hall swung open, and the air in the room seemed to get sucked out, leaving a vacuum of pure dread. Alara didn't look up. She kept her head bowed, her hair falling over her face like a curtain, her brush moving in a steady, frantic circle on the stone. But she felt him. He walked with the gait of a predator who had never known fear. Every footfall resonated through the floorboards and into Alara's knees. He stopped in the center of the hall, only 20 feet from where she knelt. "Alpha King Draven," Alpha Miller of the Shadow Creek Pack said, his voice trembling with a submissive edge that made Alara's stomach turn. "We are honored by your presence. My pack is yours." "Your pack is a mess, Miller," a voice replied. The voice was a low, resonant rumble. It wasn't loud, but it occupied every corner of the room. It was a voice that commanded the stars to move, and they would likely obey. "The borders are porous, your warriors are soft, and your air." Draven paused. Alara heard the distinct sound of him inhaling deeply. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, terrified bird. "Your air," Draven continued, his tone shifting to something sharper, more dangerous, "smells of secrets." Alara gripped the brush so hard the wood creaked. "Don't look up, don't look up, don't look up." Suddenly, the heavy leather boots moved. They didn't go toward the Alpha's throne. They moved toward the corner, toward the shadows. Toward her. The boots stopped 6 inches from her bucket of dirty water. The scent of lightning and cedar was so thick now she could almost taste it. "You," Draven said. Alara froze. The entire room was silent, 100 pairs of eyes fixed on the wolfless, servant, and the King of Kings. "Look at me, Omega," he commanded. It wasn't a request. It was an Alpha's command. It vibrated through the air, a golden thread of will that wrapped around Alara's spine and yanked. The aconite in her system screamed as it fought the command. Her body trembled, caught between the chemical suppression and the king's power. Slowly, agonizingly, Alara raised her head. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. As Alara's chin rose, the movement felt as though she were lifting the weight of the entire mountain range that bordered Shadow Creek. Her neck muscles corded, the skin there pale and shimmering with a fine sheen of cold sweat. The aconite was a leaden weight in her blood, a gray sludge that tried to pull her gaze back down to the dirt where she belonged. But Draven's command was a golden hook, uncompromising and absolute. When her eyes finally met his, the impact was visceral. It wasn't just a look, it was a collision. Alpha King Draven was a symphony of violence and majesty. His eyes were not a single color, but a shifting, turbulent amber, the color of a forest fire viewed through wood smoke. They were the eyes of a creature that had seen the rise and fall of empires and had likely held the blade that ended them. His face was a masterpiece of harsh angles, a jawline that could have been carved from the very obsidian he was rumored to love, a straight, noble nose, and a mouth that looked as though it had forgotten how to smile, set in a grim, permanent line of authority. A jagged scar ran from the corner of his left eye down to his cheekbone, a silver lightning bolt against his sun-bronzed skin. It didn't mar his beauty, it sanctified it, proving that this was a king who bled with his soldiers. But it was his presence, his aura asterisk, that nearly shattered Alara's resolve. It was a physical pressure, a localized gravity that made the air feel thick and heavy, like the moments before a devastating flood. Behind him, the shadows of the great hall seemed to lengthen, stretching toward him as if he were their source. Draven's amber eyes narrowed. He didn't speak immediately. He searched. He leaned in, his face inches from hers, and for a terrifying second, Alara thought he could see right through the mud-colored tint of her irises to the celestial fire hidden beneath. "You struggle," Draven murmured. His voice was lower now, a private thunder intended only for her. "Most Omegas would have collapsed under the weight of my voice before their chin even cleared their chest. Yet you fight it. You hold your spine like a warrior, even while you dress like a beggar." In the back of her mind, Luna roared. The silver wolf, usually dampened into a dull ache by the aconite, was clawing at the walls of her consciousness. The proximity of a true alpha, the king of all alphas, was like a match dropped into a pool of gasoline. Nero *, Luna whispered, a name Alara shouldn't have known. "The Black King. He is here." "Be silent," Alara screamed internally, throwing every ounce of her mental strength into reinforcing the barriers. She forced her body to go limp, to mimic the weakness she was supposed to possess. She let her shoulders slouch, her gaze becoming watery and unfocused. "I am nothing, Your Majesty," she rasped. The words were a lie, but she spoke them with the practiced cadence of a decade of servitude. "Just a broken wolf. My spirit is weak. That is why I struggle." Draven's hand moved. It was a blur of motion, too fast for a human to follow, but Alara's predatory instincts tracked it perfectly. He caught her by the chin, his thumb brushing against her lower lip. His skin was searingly hot, a stark contrast to the chilled air of the hall. The touch sent a jolt of electricity through her that nearly made her shift on the spot. It was a mate spark, weakened by her suppression, but undeniably there. She felt his heart rate spike through his fingertips. He felt it too. "Broken," Draven's voice was a dangerous silk. He turned her head side to side, inspecting her like a piece of livestock, but his eyes were burning with a terrifying curiosity. "There is a scent on you, little ghost, beneath the lie and the damp wool, beneath the bitterness of the herbs you've been consuming." He leaned closer, his nose grazing the sensitive skin of her neck, just below the ear. Alara stopped breathing. Every nerve ending in her body was screaming for her to either run or rip his throat out. "Aconite," he whispered against her skin. "You drink it like water. Why would an Omega need to suppress a wolf that supposedly doesn't exist?" A cold dread, deeper than any winter, settled in Alara's chest. He knew. He didn't know what she was yet, but he knew she was a lie. "I have fits, my lord," she lied, her voice trembling, this time with genuine fear. "The herbs keep my mind quiet. Without them, I am unstable." Draven pulled back, his amber eyes searching hers for a long, agonizing minute. The rest of the pack watched in stunned silence. Alpha Miller stepped forward, his face a mask of oily concern. "Your Majesty, please," Miller said, his voice forcedly light. "Don't let the stray bother you. She's been touched in the head since her parents died in the fires. She's a charity case. We keep her out of pity." Draven didn't look at Miller. He didn't even acknowledge the Alpha's existence. His focus remained entirely on Alara. He slowly released her chin, but he didn't move away. He loomed over her, a dark god in a hall of mortals. "A charity case," Draven repeated, his eyes never leaving Alara. "Is that what you are? A piece of trash that Shadow Creek so graciously keeps in its attic?" Alara swallowed, the aconite-induced dryness making it hurt. "Yes, my lord." Draven's lip curled into a tiny, cruel smirk. "Then you won't mind if I take the trash with me. A king always needs someone to scrub the boots of his guard." The room gasped. Alpha Miller's face went from pale to a sickly shade of purple. "Your Majesty, surely you would prefer one of our high-ranking females. My daughter, Chloe, is." "I don't recall asking for your opinion, Miller," Draven said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming a physical weight that forced Miller to drop to one knee. "I like this one. She has interesting eyes." Draven reached down and gripped Alara's arm, hauling her to her feet with effortless strength. He didn't care that she was covered in scrub water. He didn't care about protocol. "Pack your things, Ghost," Draven commanded. "You leave for the capital at sunset, and if I find a single drop of aconite in your possession when we cross the border, I'll feed you to my hounds." He leaned in one last time, his lips brushing the shell of her ear. "I want to see the wolf that requires so much poison to kill," he hissed. He turned on his heel. his heavy black cloak billowing behind him like a funeral shroud, and walked out of the hall without looking back. Alara stood paralyzed in the center of the room. The silence that followed was deafening. She could feel the murderous glares of every female in the room, the confusion of the warriors, and the sheer, unadulterated rage radiating from Alpha Miller. She had spent 10 years being invisible. She had spent 10 years being a shadow. And in 5 minutes, Alpha King Draven had dragged her into the scorching light of his world. As Alara stood there, her mind raced back to the stories her grandmother used to whisper by the fireplace before the Great Purge. The silver wolves weren't just rare, they were the balance. While black wolves, like Draven's line, represented the earth and the strength, the silver wolves represented the moon and the spirit. Legend said that a king without his silver queen would eventually be consumed by his own darkness. His wolf would grow too large, too angry, and eventually he would become a feral, a beast that knew no master and no mercy. For 100 years, the silver line had been hunted. Some said it was because the alphas feared their power. Others said it was because a silver wolf's heart could grant immortality. Alara's parents had died to keep her secret, to ensure that the last spark of the moon didn't go out in a world of shadows. Now, she was being taken to the heart of the Empire. She was being taken to the one man who had the power to strip her secret bare. "We cannot go," Luna whispered, her voice stronger now that Draven's scent still hung in the air. "He will see us. He will break us." "We have no choice," Alara thought, her hands shaking as she looked at the bucket of lye. "If I run, he'll hunt me. If I stay, Miller will kill me for shamming his daughter. We go. We hide. We survive." But as she looked toward the doors through which the king had exited, a small, treacherous part of her, a part that hadn't felt warmth in a decade, throbbed with a terrifying realization. When he had touched her, the Aconite's coldness had vanished. For a split second, she hadn't felt like a ghost. She had felt like a queen. The atmosphere in the pack house had soured from frantic excitement into a curdled, viscous resentment. As Alara climbed the stairs toward her attic, she could feel the weight of 1,000 hateful gazes boring into her back. To the high-ranking she-wolves of Shadow Creek, she wasn't a girl being taken into servitude. She was a thief who had stolen the king's attention, however brief and terrifying that attention had been. She reached her small room, a space that was less a bedroom and more a coffin for her secrets. The air here was thinner, smelling of old dust, and the copper tang of the aconite she kept hidden. She stood in the center of the room, her hands trembling. "If I find a single drop of aconite in your possession, I'll feed you to my hounds." Draven's threat echoed in her mind, a low-frequency vibration that made her teeth ache. He was a king of instincts. He had smelled the suppression on her skin, even if he couldn't yet identify the nature of the wolf it was meant to smother. If she brought the root with her, he would find it. His trackers were the best in the world, their noses attuned to the slightest scent of deceit. But if she didn't take it? Luna began to pace in the back of her mind, her paws made of starlight and fury. Without the poison, the shift would become an inevitability. Every full moon, every surge of adrenaline, every time Draven's scent overwhelmed her senses, the silver wolf would claw at the gates. "We will die," Alara whispered to the empty room. "If they see you, Luna, they won't just kill us. They'll cage us. They'll breathe the light out of us until there's nothing left." "Let them try," the wolf's voice was a crystalline chime, ancient and prideful. "The Black King is the other half of the sky, Alara. Why do you fear the storm that was meant to carry us?" "Because storms destroy everything they touch," Alara snapped. She moved with sudden, frantic energy. She grabbed a small, moth-eaten satchel and began to pack. She had so little. A spare tunic, a heavy cloak that had belonged to her mother, and a small, wooden comb with a tooth missing. Then she turned to the floorboard beneath her pallet. She pried it up, revealing her remaining stash of aconite root. It looked like the gnarled fingers of a dead man. She couldn't take it, not as it was. With a heavy stone she used as a paperweight, she began to grind the root into a fine gray powder. Her movements were rhythmic, a desperate alchemy. She took the small vial of lavender oil she had scavenged from the kitchens months ago and mixed the powder into it. The floral scent of the lavender was strong enough, perhaps, to mask the metallic bitterness of the poison from a casual sniff, though it would never fool a king for long. She would have to be careful. She would have to be perfect. Packing for your grand adventure, Rat. The door to the attic slammed open, hitting the wall with a crack that sounded like a gunshot. Alara didn't need to look to know who it was. Chloe, Alpha Miller's daughter, stood in the doorway. She was dressed in a gown of deep crimson silk, her blonde hair curled into perfect ringlets, but her face was distorted by a sneer that ruined her porcelain beauty. Behind her stood two of her sycophants, girls who had spent years helping Chloe turn Alara's life into a living hell. "I am following the king's command, Chloe," Alara said, her voice flat, her back still turned. She tucked the lavender vial deep into the lining of her cloak. "The king's command," Chloe laughed, a high, brittle sound. She stepped into the room, her expensive leather boots clicking on the dusty floor. "He took you because he was disgusted, Alara. He saw a piece of filth in his path and decided to move it. Do you really think you're going to the capital to sit on a throne? You'll be lucky if you're used as a footstool for his concubines." Chloe reached out and grabbed Alara's hair, yanking her head back. Alara gasped, her eyes watering from the sharp pain. "Look at me when I speak to you, Omega," Chloe hissed, her claws beginning to elongate, a sign of her shifting temper. "You think you're special because he touched you. He was checking for disease. That's all you are, a plague." Alara stared into Chloe's eyes. For a decade, she had taken this. She had let Chloe hit her, starve her, and humiliate her. She had played the part of the weak, broken girl so well that even she sometimes forgot the power that hummed in her marrow. But today, the air was different. Draven's command had left a residue in her blood, a spark of defiance that refused to go out. "If I am a plague," Alara said, her voice dangerously calm, "then why are you so afraid of me?" Chloe's eyes widened. The insolence was new. The fire in Alara's dull brown eyes was new. With a snarl, Chloe swung her hand, her claws raking across Alara's cheek. The pain was a hot brand. 4 lines of crimson bloomed across Alara's skin. "Kill her," Luna whispered. "Tear the silk from her throat. Show her the moon." Alara clenched her fists so hard her own nails drew blood in her palms. She couldn't shift. Not here. Not now. She forced herself to go still, to let the blood drip onto her tattered tunic. "That's more like it," Chloe spat, shoving Alara away. "Stay in the dirt where you belong, and remember, the king might have taken you today, but you'll always be the girl who couldn't even shift. You're a freak of nature, Alara, a hollow shell." Chloe and her friends turned and swept out of the room, their laughter echoing down the hallway. Alara stood in the silence, the blood on her cheek beginning to itch. She reached up and touched the wound. To any other wolf, these scratches would heal in minutes, but because of the aconite, her healing was slowed to a human crawl. It was the price she paid for her mask. She picked up her satchel and walked to the window. Below, in the courtyard, the king's caravan was preparing to move. It was a sight of terrifying beauty. 50 warriors, the iron phalanx, stood mounted on massive black war horses. Their armor was midnight chrome, etched with the runes of the old world. In the center was a carriage of reinforced steel and dark wood, but Draven wasn't inside it. He was mounted on a beast of a horse that looked more like a demon than an animal, a stallion with eyes as red as embers. Draven looked up then, his gaze unerringly finding her small window at the top of the house. He didn't wave, he didn't smile. He simply stared, his amber eyes locking onto hers across the distance. Even from here, the power of his presence felt like a physical weight, a tether pulling her toward him. He saw the blood on her face. Even from 3 stories up, she saw his jaw tighten. The air around him seemed to shimmer with a sudden, violent heat. He turned his head and said something to one of his commanders, a giant of a man with a scarred throat. Minutes later, the door to Alara's attic was kicked open again. This time, it wasn't Chloe. It was the commander. "The king is impatient," the man growled, his voice like grinding stones. "He said if you aren't at the gate in 60 seconds, I'm to carry you down by your hair, and he told me to give you this." He tossed a small silk handkerchief at her. It was black, embroidered with a silver wolf's head. The irony was not lost on Alara. "Wipe your face," the commander ordered. "The king does not like his property looking damaged. It reflects poorly on his brand." Alara took the silk and pressed it to her cheek. It smelled of him, cedar and lightning. The scent was so overwhelming that for a moment, her vision blurred. "I'm ready," she said, her voice regaining its strength. She walked past the commander, down the stairs, and out of the pack house for the last time. She didn't look at Alpha Miller, who stood on the porch looking like he'd swallowed a lemon. She didn't look at Chloe, whose face was a mask of pale fury. She walked straight to the king's stallion. Draven looked down at her. He leaned over his saddle, his face inches from hers. He reached out and, with a surprisingly gentle motion, used his thumb to tilt her head back, inspecting the scratches Chloe had left. "Who did this?" he asked. The question wasn't a question. It was a death warrant. Alara looked him in the eye. "The wind, my lord. Shadow Creek is a very turbulent place." A flicker of something, was it respect, passed through Draven's amber eyes. "A lie, a poor one, but I admire the spine it takes to tell it to my face." He straightened up and signaled to his men. "Throw her in the carriage," Draven commanded. "We have 3 days of hard riding before we reach the citadel, and someone tell Alpha Miller that if any more of my property is damaged before I leave his lands, I'll burn his forest to the ash it deserves." As Alara was ushered into the dark, velvet-lined interior of the carriage, the heavy door clicking shut behind her, she realized with a jolt of terror that she wasn't just leaving her home. She was entering the lion's den, and the lion had already tasted her blood. The King's Guard, the Iron Phalanx, are not just warriors, they are bound wolves. Through a blood ritual, they have tied their life forces to the king. If he dies, they die. This makes them the most loyal and the most lethal force in the known world. For Alara, being surrounded by them means there is no escape. Their senses are heightened by the bond, making it nearly impossible for her to use her powder without being noticed. The carriage was a tomb of velvet and iron. As the wheels began to churn against the gravel, the rhythmic asterisk thud-clack sounded to Alara like a funeral drum. She sat huddled in the corner of the plush, midnight blue bench, her satchel clutched to her chest like a shield. The interior of the transport was far too luxurious for a servant. It smelled of expensive tobacco, ancient parchment, and the lingering, intoxicating scent of the king who had clearly occupied it recently. Outside the small, barred window, the world she had known for 10 years began to slide away. The gray, sagging rooftops of the Shadow Creek pack house, the mud-slicked training grounds, the jagged silhouette of the weeping willows where she had once hidden to cry, all of it was being swallowed by the dense, evergreen maw of the northern forest. She should have felt relief. She was escaping her tormentors. But as she watched the silhouettes of the Iron Phalanx riders flanking the carriage, their black armor gleaming like beetle shells in the fatting light, she felt only a cold, sharpening dread. She was no longer a ghost. She was a curiosity. And to an alpha like Draven, a curiosity was something to be dissected until its inner workings were laid bare. "He is watching us," Luna whispered. The wolf was restless, packing the perimeter of Alara's ribcage. "Even through the wood and the steel, I feel his eyes. He is a predator who has found a new scent, Alara. He will not let the trail go cold." "He smells a lie, not a wolf," Alara countered silently. "As long as I keep the aconite in my blood, he will find nothing but a broken girl." She reached into the lining of her cloak, her fingers brushing the cool glass of the lavender-scented vial. The urge to take another dose was overwhelming. Her skin felt too tight, her senses beginning to sharpen as the previous dose began to wane. She could hear the heartbeat of the horse pulling the carriage. She could smell the pine resin bleeding from a tree 50 yards away. These were the first signs of her light returning. She couldn't afford to be bright in the king's presence. Suddenly, the carriage jerked to a violent halt. The horses whinnied in protest, their hooves digging into the soft earth. Alara was thrown forward, her shoulder hitting the opposite door with a dull thud. "Out." The word was a low vibration that seemed to come from the very air itself. The carriage door was ripped open. The evening sun had dipped below the horizon, bathing the forest in a bruised, purple twilight. Standing in the doorway was Draven. He had dismounted, and without the height of his stallion, his physical presence was even more stifling. He filled the entire frame, his broad shoulders blocking out the light. "My lord," Alara stammered, shrinking back into the shadows of the carriage. I find I dislike the silence of my horse, Draven said. His amber eyes were glowing now, two coals in the gathering dark. And I find I have questions that require answers. Move. He didn't wait for her to comply. He reached in, his large hand wrapping around her upper arm. His grip wasn't painful, but it was inescapable, a shackle of warm, pulsing flesh. He hauled her out of the carriage as if she weighed nothing. The iron phalanx had set up a temporary perimeter. The warriors stood like statues, their faces hidden behind their visors, their scents muted by the heavy scent of horse sweat and cold steel. "Wait here," Draven commanded his men. He didn't look back as he led Alara toward a small clearing away from the main path, deep enough into the trees that the sounds of the caravan became a muffled hum. He stopped near a fallen cedar, its bark silvered by age. He released her arm and turned, crossing his arms over his chest. The scar on his cheek looked like a jagged white vein in the moonlight. "Strip," he said. Illyra's heart stopped. A cold sweat broke out across her brow. "What?" "The cloak, the tunic," Draven clarified, his voice devoid of any sexual heat. It was the cold, clinical tone of an inquisitor. "I want to see the Marks Miller's daughter left on you, and I want to see why your body smells like a pharmacy and a graveyard." "My lord, please," Illyra whispered, her hands shaking. "I am just an Omega. I am not fit for your gaze." "You are a liar," Draven countered, stepping into her personal space. The scent of lightning and cedar intensified, making Luna howl in Illyra's mind. "You have been in my presence for 4 hours, and not once has your scent changed. Not once has your heart rate spiked in a way that suggests submission. Even the strongest warriors tremble when I stand this close. But you are a stone." He reached out, his fingers catching the collar of her tunic. "Is it the aconite?" he asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Is that what makes you so cold, little ghost? Are you so afraid of your own nature that you would rather be a corpse than a wolf?" "I have no wolf," Illyra cried out, the lie tearing at her throat. "I am a failure. That is why they treated me like trash, because I am empty." Draven's eyes flashed, a brilliant, terrifying gold. The air pressure dropped. The leaves on the ground began to swirl in a sudden, localized wind. "Empty," he growled. He leaned in, his nose brushing against the wound on her cheek. The scratch was still weeping slightly, the blood bright and red. He inhaled the scent of her pain, and for a moment his expression shifted from anger to something far more complex, a hunger that wasn't for flesh, but for truth. "There is a hum in your blood, Illyra," he murmured, his lips almost touching the skin of her throat. "I can hear it, like a song played behind a locked door. You think you are hiding, but you are screaming in a language only I can hear." He pulled back, his gaze dropping to the satchel she still held. With a flick of his wrist, he snatched it from her. "No," Illyra lunged for it, but he held it high above his head, his strength mocking her efforts. He reached into the bag, his large fingers rummaging through her meager belongings. He tossed the spare tunic aside. He ignored the wooden comb. His hand emerged holding the small vial of lavender oil, the one she had laced with the powdered root. "Lavender," Draven said, uncorking the vial. He took a deep breath. Illyra held her breath, her entire existence hanging by a thread. The lavender was strong, she had made sure of it. But Draven's wolf, Nero, was the king of the north. His senses were legendary. Draven's eyes narrowed. He tipped a drop of the oil onto his finger and brought it to his tongue. The world went silent. Illyra could hear the distant owl, the rustle of a mouse in the brush, the frantic asterisk thud-thud-thud of her own heart. Draven's face didn't change, but his eyes. They darkened until the amber was swallowed by obsidian. He slowly recorked the vial and looked at her. "This is not oil," he said, his voice a low, vibrating roar. "This is a cage. You are poisoning yourself. Every day you are killing the very thing that makes you whole." He stepped toward her, and this time Illyra didn't back away. She couldn't. The sheer force of his will had pinned her to the spot. "Why?" he demanded, his hand coming up to cup her jaw, his thumb pressing firmly against the pulse point in her neck. "What are you so afraid of that you would choose this slow, agonizing death? Who told you that your wolf was a sin?" Illyra looked up at him, and for the first time in 10 years, the mask cracked. A single tear escaped, tracing a path through the dust on her face. "It's not a sin," she whispered, her voice breaking. "It's a death sentence." Draven's grip softened, but his intensity did not. He looked at her as if she were a riddle he was finally beginning to solve. He didn't know she was the Silver Wolf, not yet, but he knew she was something more than a servant. "In my kingdom," Draven said, his voice surprisingly gentle, "we do not execute the powerful, we crown them." He took the vial, and before Alara could stop him, he hurled it against the trunk of a nearby oak tree. The glass shattered, the lavender and aconite soaking into the bark. "No," Alara gasped, reaching out as if she could catch the spilled liquid. "I need that, you don't understand." "I understand that you are under my protection now," Draven said, his voice regaining its kingly iron. "And I do not allow my people to carry poison. From this moment forward, you will eat at my table, you will sleep near my chambers, and you will stop hiding." He turned and began to walk back toward the caravan, his cloak swirling around his boots. "Wait," Alara called out, her voice echoing through the trees. "Where am I supposed to sleep? You said, near your chambers." Draven stopped and looked over his shoulder. A ghost of a smirk touched his lips, the first sign of anything resembling a smile she had seen on him. It wasn't kind. It was the smile of a hunter who had just trapped his prey. "The carriage is too small for two," he said. "You will ride with me on the stallion. I want to feel the moment the poison leaves your system. I want to be the first thing your wolf sees when she finally wakes up." He whistled, and the massive, red-eyed stallion trotted forward from the shadows. Alara stood in the clearing, the scent of lavender fatting into the smell of the coming rain. Without the vial, she had perhaps 12 hours before the light began to leak out. 12 hours before her skin began to glow, before her scent changed from broken to celestial. She looked at the king, sitting atop his demon horse, reaching out a hand to her. She was stepping into a fire, and for the first time in a decade, she wasn't sure if she wanted to put it out. Silver wolves do not smell like common wolves. While a typical werewolf might smell of earth, musk, or rain, a silver wolf carries the scent of starlight, a metallic ozone-like fragrance that feels cool to the senses. To an alpha like Draven, whose scent is heat and storm, the silver wolf is his natural polar opposite. The closer Alara gets to her true form, the more her scent will act as a beacon to every predator within 100 miles. The night was no longer a shield, it was a witness. As Draven pulled Alara up onto the massive stallion, the world seemed to contract until it consisted only of the two of them and the rhythmic, powerful gait of the beast beneath them. The stallion, a creature of nightmare and muscle named Malphaz, snorted a plume of hot mist into the freezing air, his red eyes glowing like dying embers in the dark. Alara was forced to sit in front of the king, her back pressed against his iron-hard chest. It was a position of total vulnerability and terrifying intimacy. His arms corded around her, his hands steady on the reins, effectively caging her within his heat. And Draven was *hot*. Even through the layers of leather and wool, he radiated a temperature that should have been impossible for a living being. It was the alpha fire, a physical manifestation of his wolf's dominance. For Alara, it was agony. Without her lavender-laced aconite, the silence she had cultivated for a decade was beginning to fray at the edges. Usually, the withdrawal happened in the safety of her attic, where she could sweat and shake in the dark. Now, she was undergoing it in the arms of the most dangerous man alive. The first stage of the withdrawal was the sharpening asterisk. It started with her hearing. The dull, muffled world of the Omega servant began to dissolve. The sound of the iron phalanx's horses behind them, which had been a distant thrum, suddenly became a cacophony. She could hear the individual clink of every chain mail link, the rhythmic breathing of 50 warriors, and the low, guttural growls of the wolves as they communicated through the mind link. Then came the asterisk inversion asterisk. The cold night air, which had been biting at her skin, suddenly felt different. She could feel the friction of the wind against the microscopic hairs on her arms. She could feel the individual threads of Draven's cloak against her neck. Every sensation was magnified by 1,000, turning a simple ride into a sensory assault. "You're shaking," Draven's voice rumbled against her spine. It wasn't a question, it was an observation. His breath stirred the stray hairs at the nape of her neck, sending a violent shiver down her corded muscles. "It's the cold, my lord," she whispered. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, richer, deeper, vibrating with a resonance she hadn't heard in years. "Lie to me again, ghost, and I'll leave you in the woods for the rogues," Draven said. His grip on the reins tightened, pulling her even closer against him. "The fever is taking you. I can feel the aconite burning out of your blood. It smells like ozone, like the air before a lightning strike." He leaned forward, his chin resting near her shoulder. He was inhaling her, tracking the chemical change in her pores with the precision of a master tracker. "Tell me," Draven murmured, "what happens when the poison is gone? Does the broken girl stay, or does something else come out to play?" Alara clenched her teeth so hard her jaw ached. "Don't let him see. Don't let him see." "Let him see." Luna's voice was no longer a whisper. It was a chime of silver bells ringing in her skull. "The Black King wants the truth, Alara. Why do you feed him ashes when we are made of stars?" Suddenly, Malphaz reared up with a piercing neigh. The horses behind them went into a frenzy. From the thicket of trees to their left, a scent erupted, the rancid, rotting stench of ****ferals***. Ferals were not like the organized packs of the north. They were wolves who had lost their humanity, creatures who had stayed in their shifted forms for so long that their minds had snapped. They were husks of bone and matted fur, driven by a hunger that could never be sated. "Ambush!" the commander shouted from the rear. In the blink of an eye, the forest erupted into chaos. 6 massive, mangy wolves, each the size of a small carriage, leapt from the shadows. They didn't go for the warriors, they went for the center. They went for the king. Draven didn't flinch. He didn't even draw his sword at first. He simply tightened his grip on Alara with one hand, while the other reached for a heavy, silver-weighted mace attached to his saddle. "Stay still," he commanded Alara. His voice wasn't just a command anymore, it was a roar of pure alpha energy. A feral, its eyes clouded with cataracts and madness, launched itself at Malphaz's throat. Alara watched in slow motion. Because of the withdrawal, her reflexes were beginning to outpace her human brain. She saw the feral's claws, the yellowed teeth, the drop of black saliva falling from its jowl. Without thinking, Alara's hand shot out. She didn't shift, she couldn't, but the speed was inhuman. She grabbed the feral's throat midair. For a split second, the beast's momentum was halted by a girl who looked like she would break in a light breeze. Then the light leaked. For a heartbeat, Alara's skin didn't just look pale, it glowed asterisk. A faint, ethereal silver pulse radiated from her fingertips into the feral's neck. The creature let out a high-pitched whimper, a sound of pure terror, as if it had touched a sun. Draven's mace came down a second later, crushing the feral's skull, but his eyes weren't on the monster. They were on Alara's hand. The battle lasted only minutes. The iron phalanx were the elite for a reason. They dismantled the ferals with cold, surgical efficiency. As the last of the monsters fell, the forest returned to a heavy, blood-scented silence. Draven dismounted, hauling Alara down with him. He didn't look at his warriors. He didn't look at the dead ferals. He grabbed Alara's hand, the one that had stopped the beast, and shoved it into the moonlight. The silver glow was gone, replaced by the dull, muddy skin of the Omega, but the scent remained. The lavender was gone. The aconite was failing. The clearing now smelled like a celestial garden in the middle of a slaughterhouse. "Explain that," Draven hissed. His eyes were no longer amber. They were a terrifying, swirling gold. "Explain how an Omega with no wolf just stopped a 300-pound feral with her bare hand." Alara looked at him, her chest heaving, the sweat on her brow shining like diamonds in the moon. The sharpening was complete. She could see the individual pulses of his jugular vein. She could hear the blood rushing through his heart. I don't know," she lied, but her voice failed her. Draven stepped closer, his aura expanding until the surrounding warriors took a collective step back. He took her hand and brought it to his face, his eyes never leaving hers. He didn't kiss it. He scented it. "You smell of the high heavens," he whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of awe and predatory intent. "You smell of a myth I was told died a century ago." He leaned in, his lips hovering over the pulse point of her wrist. "Who are you, Alara? And why do I feel the urge to burn the world down just to keep you in my sight?" Alara looked up at the moon, which was nearly full. She felt the first real crack in her soul. The silver wolf wasn't just waking up. She was coming for her throne. Ferals are attracted to high-energy sources. Normally, they hunt alphas to consume their power. However, a silver wolf is like a beacon of pure source energy. The Ferals weren't just attacking the king, they were drawn to the awakening light inside Alara. This is the first time she realizes that her mask wasn't just hiding her from the alphas, it was hiding her from the monsters of the world. The ascent into the Frostfell Pass was a journey into a world of white and bone. As the caravan climbed higher, the air grew thin and razor-sharp, tasting of ancient ice and the faint, sulphurous tang of the volcanic vents that dotted the northern range. The lush greens of the Shadow Creek territories were gone, replaced by the jagged, gray teeth of the mountains. For Alara, the change in altitude was a catalyst for the disaster brewing in her blood. Without the aconite to weigh her down, the silver fever began to take hold. It was a phenomenon known only to the extinct line of the Moonborn, the process of the soul expanding to fill a body that had been shrunken by fear. Her skin felt feverish, yet she shivered with a cold that didn't come from the wind. Every time Malphaz's hooves struck the frozen ground, the vibration traveled through Draven's body and into hers, feeling like a lightning strike to her sensitized nerves. "We stop at Iron Gate Station," Draven's voice vibrated through her, sounding more like a predator's purr than ever. "You're burning up, little ghost. If I didn't know better, I'd say your wolf is trying to eat you from the inside out." Alara couldn't respond. She was too busy fighting the urge to tilt her head back and let out a sound that wasn't human. Iron Gate Station was a grim, stone fortress carved directly into the side of a cliff. It was a place for soldiers, harsh, utilitarian, and smelling of wet dogs and wood smoke. As the king's retinue clattered into the courtyard, the soldiers stationed there dropped to their knees, a sea of steel and fur bowing before their sovereign. Draven didn't wait for the formalities. He dismounted in one fluid motion, keeping Alara tucked under one arm as if she were a precious, fragile trophy. He carried her past the bowing guards, through the heavy iron-studded doors, and straight into the private solar reserved for the king. He kicked the door shut, the boom echoing through the stone room. He set her down on a heavy, fur-covered chair near a roaring hearth. "Look at me," he commanded. Alara's head snapped up. The command was softer this time, but her body obeyed with terrifying alacrity. Her vision was swimming. The fire in the hearth didn't look like orange flames. It looked like a dancing spectrum of ultraviolet and gold. The sharpening was over. She was entering the asterisk radiance. Draven stood before her, his black cloak discarded. He wore a simple tunic of dark leather that clung to the ridged muscles of his chest. He looked down at her, his amber eyes tracking the way her pupils were blown wide, swallowing the muddy brown and revealing slivers of iridescent silver at the edges. "The lavender is gone," Draven said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "The aconite is a memory, and yet you still haven't shifted. Your bones should be breaking, your fur should be rending your skin. Why are you still in this cage, Alara?" I can't," she gasped, her hands clutching the arms of the chair so hard the wood began to splinter. "It's been too long, she's stuck." It was a half-truth. Luna wasn't stuck, she was waiting for Alara to stop holding the door shut. Draven knelt between her knees, a position of such intense dominance and intimacy that Alara's heart nearly stopped. He took her hands, forcing her to release the wood. He held her palms open, looking at the silver-white scars that were beginning to glow with a faint, bioluminescent light. "You are not a failure," Draven whispered, his eyes burning into hers. "You are a masterpiece of suppression, but even the strongest dam eventually breaks." He reached for a small, silver dagger at his belt. Alara flinched, but he didn't point it at her. Instead, he made a shallow cut across his own palm. The scent of his blood hit the air, rich, copper-heavy, and pulsing with the power of a true alpha. To a wolf in the middle of a fever, it was the ultimate bait. "Nero wants to meet her," Draven murmured, holding his bleeding hand toward her face. "Drink, take my strength. Let it be the key that unlocks the door." The blood bond, asterisk Alara thought, a wave of terror washing over her. If she tasted his blood, their souls would be tethered. He would be able to hear her thoughts, feel her wolf, and know every secret she had ever buried. Do it, Luna urged, her voice now a deafening roar of starlight. He is the king. He is the storm. We need his thunder to break our silence. No, Alara choked out, turning her head away. I won't be your slave, Draven. I won't be another weapon in your armory. Draven's hand moved, his fingers tangling in her hair, forcing her to look at him again. His expression wasn't one of anger, but of a desperate, terrifying hunger. You think this is about power, he hissed. I have a kingdom, I have an army, I don't need a weapon, I need you. The admission hung in the air, heavier than the stone walls of the fortress. I have spent 10 years looking for the scent I smelled in that hall, Draven continued, his voice shaking with a rare emotion. The scent of the one who could stand in the center of my storm and not be swept away. The one the prophecies said was dead, the silver wolf. Alara's breath hitched. There are no silver wolves. They were hunted to extinction, you know that. I know what the histories say, Draven said, leaning in until their foreheads touched. But histories are written by the victors, and the victors were afraid. They were afraid of a wolf that could heal with a touch and lead with a whisper. They were afraid of the only creature who could command the king of alphas. He pressed his bleeding palm against her lips. Stop hiding, Alara. The world is already burning. You might as well be the fire. The taste of his blood was a catalyst. The second it touched her tongue, the Aconite's last defenses shattered. A shockwave of pure, crystalline energy exploded from Alara's core. The stone floor beneath them cracked. The windows of the solar shattered outward, glass shards falling like diamonds into the snow below. Alara's back arched, her mouth opening in a silent scream as her skeleton began to rewrite itself. It wasn't the painful, bone-grinding shift of a normal werewolf. It was an unfolding. It was like a flower blooming in a time lapse, or a star collapsing into a nebula. The light in the room became blinding, a brilliant, shimmering silver that swallowed the shadows and turned the fire in the hearth to ash. Draven didn't move. He stayed right there in the center of the explosion, his eyes wide and weeping from the brilliance. He watched as the girl he had found scrubbing floors disappeared, and in her place, a creature of myth emerged. She was larger than any wolf he had ever seen, yet she was elegant, her limbs long and powerful. Her fur wasn't just white, it was metallic, each strand of hair seemingly spun from moonlight and mercury. Her eyes were twin moons of pure, glowing silver, devoid of pupils, seeing into the very fabric of the world. The silver wolf stood in the center of the room, her presence so immense that the air itself seemed to hum with a holy frequency. Draven slowly rose to his feet. He looked small in front of her, yet he didn't cower. The door to the solar burst open. The commander and a dozen warriors charged in, swords drawn, sensing the massive surge of power. They stopped dead, the weapons slipping from their hands as they stared at the legend standing before them. Your Majesty, the commander whispered, dropping to both knees. It can't be. Draven didn't look back at his men. He stepped forward, reaching out a hand toward the silver wolf's muzzle. 10 years, Draven whispered, his voice thick with awe. You hid this for 10 years. The silver wolf let out a low, melodic chuff. She stepped forward, pressing her cold, wet nose against his palm. In that contact, the bond was sealed. Draven's mind was suddenly flooded with Alara's memories, the fire, the aconite, the years of silence, and the fierce, burning love she had for the secret she carried. But there was something else, a warning. The silver wolf looked toward the window, toward the dark peaks of the mountains. Beyond the borders of the kingdom, something was stirring. The return of the silver wolf hadn't just been felt by the king. The hunters of the old world, the ones who had started the purge a century ago, had just seen a light in the north, and they were already coming to put it out. Draven's jaw set into a hard line of iron. He turned to his men, his eyes glowing with the reflected silver of his queen. Ready the horses, Draven commanded, his voice shaking the very foundations of the fortress. We don't go to the citadel, we go to war. The transition from flesh to fur was not a singular event, it was a deluge. For 10 years, Alara had lived in a world of muted colors and muffled sounds, a life lived behind a thick, frosted pane of glass. Now, that glass had shattered, and the sheer velocity of the world rushed in to fill the void. Standing on four paws for the first time since she was a child, Alara, Luna**, felt the ancient stone of Iron Gate Station vibrating beneath her claws. The stone wasn't just cold, it was a living map of history. She could feel the echoes of every soldier who had marched across it, the microscopic cracks where the frost had expanded, and the deep, molten heartbeat of the mountain itself far below. Her vision was the most jarring change. She no longer saw things. She saw asterisk energies. Draven didn't just stand before her. He was a towering pillar of obsidian fire, his aura swirling with the predatory shadows of his wolf, Nero. The air in the room was a tapestry of scents, each a different color. The metallic tang of the spilled blood on Draven's palm was a sharp, poolsing crimson. The fear of the soldiers at the door was a sickly, sour yellow, and her own scent, the silver ozone, was a shimmering veil that seemed to wash over everything like moonlight on water. "Can you hear me?" The voice didn't come from her ears. It echoed in the very center of her being. It was Draven. Through the blood bond, the mental barriers between them had been reduced to ash. Luna tilted her massive, silver head. She looked at him with eyes that were two infinite pools of starlight. She didn't have words yet. The human part of her was still reeling, but she sent a pulse of recognition back to him. It was a feeling of vast, cool space and a hunger for the sky. "The king, he has found the core," the commander whispered, his voice trembling. He remained on his knees, his forehead pressed against the cold floor. In the werewolf world, there were alphas, and then there were origins. The silver wolf was an origin, the source from which the magic of their kind was said to flow. Draven didn't look at his men. His hand was still outstretched, hovering inches from Luna's silver muzzle. His own wolf, Nero, was clawing at the surface of his skin, desperate to shift, to run with the moon beast, to claim the light that completed his shadow. "Stand up, Marcus," Draven said, his voice carrying the weight of a decree. "And tell the men to prepare the great hearth. The silver wolf has returned, but she is weak from the poison. If any man speaks of what he saw here today to anyone outside this fortress, I will personally ensure he never sees another sunrise." Luna let out a low, vibrating rumble, a sound that was half purr, half warning. She stepped toward the shattered window. The mountain air was calling to her. She needed to run. She needed to burn off the remnants of the aconite that still clung to her cells like oily sludge. "Not yet," Draven's voice was firm in her mind. "The shadows are moving, Alara. You've just lit a signal fire in the middle of a dark ocean. Wait for me." But Luna was beyond the reach of human logic. With a powerful spring of her hind legs, she launched herself through the broken window. "Alara," Draven roared. She didn't fall. She flowed. She hit the vertical stone of the cliff face and bounded downward, her silver claws finding purchase in the ice with effortless grace. She was a streak of mercury against the dark granite. She reached the base of the fortress and vanished into the pine forest, her speed so great that she was little more than a blur of light moving through the trees. For Alara, the sensation was pure ecstasy. Every muscle was a coiled spring, every breath was a gulp of liquid life. She wasn't running through the forest, she was part of it. The trees seemed to lean in as she passed, their needles whispering her name. But as she reached a high ridge overlooking the valley, the ecstasy was cut short by a sudden, jarring cold. It wasn't the cold of the snow, it was a spiritual frost. Luna skidded to a halt, her ears swiveling toward the north. Far across the peaks, where the sky met the horizon, a cluster of black sparks was rising. They looked like crows, but they were too large, too uniform. The hunters of the old world had not been idle in the century since the silver line went quiet. They had bred creatures specifically designed to track the celestial frequency. These were the Shadowhounds, beasts born of ritual and cruelty, devoid of souls, meant only to extinguish the light. Luna bared her teeth, a low, melodic snarl rippling through the air. The light of her coat began to pulse, a rhythmic strobe that signaled her defiance. "Come back," Draven's voice slammed into her mind. this time accompanied by a wave of such intense protection it felt like a physical shield. "They are closer than we thought. They have been waiting for this pulse." Luna turned, her heart hammering against her ribs. She saw him then, a massive black wolf, as dark as the void between stars, leaping from the high walls of the iron gate. Nero. Draven had shifted. He was a titan of a wolf, his fur like velvet midnight, his eyes glowing with the fierce amber fire of a king. He tore through the forest toward her, his paws leaving deep rifts in the earth. He reached the ridge in seconds, sliding to a stop beside her. He was larger than she was, his bulk designed for war and crushing power, but together they looked like the two halves of a celestial coin. The sun and the moon, the shadow and the light. Nero pressed his flank against hers, his fur crackling with static electricity as their auras merged. The contact was like an explosion. A dome of energy, half silver, half black, shimmered into existence around them, flattening the trees for 50 yards in every direction. "We are not the prey," Draven's voice echoed, no longer just his, but combined with the guttural roar of Nero. "Let them come. I have waited my entire life to see what happens when the silver wolf fights by my side." In the distance, the first of the shadowhounds broke the tree line. They were horrific things, skeletal, draped in tattered black skin, their eyes glowing with a sickly violet light. They didn't howl, they shrieked, a sound that tore at the sanity of any lesser wolf. Elara felt the fear try to rise, the old habit of the Omega, wanting to hide, to shrink to be nothing. But Luna stepped forward. She raised her head toward the full moon, which had finally cleared the mountain peaks. She opened her maw and let out a howl that wasn't a cry of pain, but a symphony. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated power that shook the very stars in their orbits. The silver wolf was no longer hiding, and the world was about to find out exactly why she had been kept a secret. The ridge became a cathedral of violence. The shadowhounds did not move like living things. They flickered. One moment they were 60 yards away, a blur of violet eyes and tattered smoke. The next, they were a heartbeat from the perimeter of the light. They moved with a jagged, stop-motion grace that defied the laws of physics, their claws scraping against the reality of the physical world with a sound like rusted needles on glass. Nero, the king's black wolf, stood like a mountain of obsidian. He didn't wait for the first strike. With a roar that vibrated in Elara's very marrow, he lunged. The contrast between them was a masterclass in elemental power. Where Nero was the hammer, all-crushing weight, snapping bone, and raw, visceral strength, Luna was the scalpel. She found herself moving with an instinctual fluidity she hadn't known she possessed. She wasn't just running, she was asterisk weaving through the air. "Left," Draven's voice barked in her mind. Luna spun, her silver tail leaving a trail of sparkling dust in the air. A shadowhound had tried to leap from the veil of the void, its jaws open to reveal a throat made of nothingness. Luna met it midair. She didn't bite, not yet. She struck with her paw, and the moment her silver fur touched the hound's shadowy hide, a hiss of steam erupted. The hound shrieked as if doused in acid. To a creature of the void, the silver wolf's touch was holy fire. But there were too many. For every hound Nero crushed beneath his massive paws, two more seemed to congeal from the darkness. The Order of the Eclipse had sent a legion to ensure the silver wolf didn't survive her first night of freedom. Then, the unthinkable happened. One of the larger hounds, a beast with 3 rows of jagged, violet-stained teeth, managed to catch Nero's flank. Usually the king's hide was impenetrable, but these were not normal predators. The hound's bite didn't just tear flesh, it drained color. Where the teeth sank in, Nero's black fur turned a sickly, ashen gray. The king let out a guttural whimper of pain that echoed through the bond, a cold, numbing sensation that threatened to shut down Elara's own heart. "Draven!" Elara screamed internally. The sight of the king, the man who had dragged her out of the dirt, the man who was currently her only tether to the world, bleeding gray light triggered something deep within Elara. The 10 years of scrubbing floors, the 10 years of being Chloe's punching bag, the 10 years of suppressing the sun inside her. All of it coalesced into a single, white-hot point of rage. She stopped running. She stood in the center of the ridge, her silver fur beginning to stand on end, crackling with a terrifying amount of static energy. Alara, no, you aren't ready for the flare. Draven's voice was frantic, his wolf struggling to shake off the void poison. But she wasn't listening to the king. She was listening to the moon. Luna planted her feet, her silver eyes glowing so brightly they illuminated the valley for miles. She didn't howl. She breathed. She drew in the cold, mountain air, and as she exhaled, she released the asterisk silver flare. It wasn't a sound. It was an expansion. A dome of pure, crystalline light exploded from her body. It wasn't hot, but it was absolute. It swept across the ridge like a tidal wave of mercury. Every shadowhound caught in the radius didn't just die, they were asterisk unmade. They disintegrated into harmless ash, their violet eyes flickering out like blown candles. The darkness was not just pushed back, it was annihilated. When the light finally faded, the ridge was silent. The forest was scorched white, the trees coated in a fine layer of silver frost. The shadowhounds were gone. Luna stood in the center of the devastation, her chest heaving, her silver light dimmed to a faint, flickering ember. The flare had drained her. Her legs gave way, and she collapsed into the snow. A moment later, a warm, heavy weight pressed against her side. Nero was there. The gray stain on his flank was fatting, the silver flare having purged the void poison from his system. He licked her ear, a gesture of profound tenderness from a beast that knew only war. "You saved me, little ghost," Draven's voice was a soft, trembling whisper in her mind. "But you've shown them everything. The whole world knows where you are now." He shifted first. The massive black wolf blurred and reformed into the man, naked, scarred, and magnificent in the moonlight. He didn't care about the cold. He knelt in the snow and gathered the silver wolf's head into his lap. "Shift back, Alara," he pleaded, his voice hoarse. "I need to see your eyes. I need to know you're still in there." With a slow, agonizing effort, the silver fur receded. The bones shortened. The light faded. Alara lay in his arms, human once more, draped in the remnants of her mother's cloak which had somehow survived the transformation. She looked up at him, her eyes no longer muddy brown, but a clear, piercing blue-silver, the true color of the moonborn. "I'm here," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. Draven looked down at her, his expression a mixture of awe, terror, and an burgeoning, possessive love that frightened her more than the hounds ever could. He leaned down, pressing his forehead against hers. "The mask is gone, Alara," he said, his amber eyes burning with a new, dark purpose. "From this night on, you are no longer a servant of Shadow Creek. You are the heartbeat of the North, and I will burn every kingdom to the ground before I let them take you from me again." He stood up, lifting her into his arms as if she were made of the finest glass. He turned his back on the ridge and began the long walk back to Iron Gate Station. Behind them, the full moon reached its zenith, casting a long, silver shadow across the mountains. The first chapter of Alara's life, the life of the ghost, was over. The era of the Silver Queen had begun. Chapter 2, The Gilded Quay. The approach to the citadel of Black Spire was nothing like the arrival at the mountain outpost. If Iron Gate was a functional tooth of the mountain, the citadel was the crown. It sat atop a volcanic plateau, a fortress of dark basalt and obsidian that seemed to have grown naturally out of the earth. Steam rose from geothermal vents around its base, creating a perpetual shroud of mist that made the massive structure appear to float above the clouds. As the king's caravan crossed the Great Bridge, a span of reinforced steel wide enough for 20 horses abreast, the sound of horns erupted from the battlements. It was a deep, resonant tone that vibrated in the soles of Alara's feet, signaling the return of the sovereign. But Alara was no longer in the carriage. She sat once more atop Malphaz, tucked securely against Draven's chest. He had refused to let her out of his sight since the battle on the ridge. She was wrapped in his personal fur-lined mantle, a garment so heavy and infused with his scent of cedar and storm that it felt like wearing a piece of his soul. "Breathe, Alara," Draven murmured into her hair. His hands were steady on the reins, but his body was a coiled spring. He could feel her heart racing, a frantic, rhythmic thrumming against his ribs. "The people you see below are not the wolves of Shadow Creek. They are my subjects. They live by my law, and my law is absolute." "Your law might be absolute, Draven," Alara whispered, her voice still raspy from the silver flare. But their curiosity is not. Look at them. She was right. The streets of the lower city were packed. Thousands of wolves had gathered to see the king return from the northern borders. But they weren't just looking for the king. Rumors travel faster than horses in the werewolf kingdoms, carried on the wind and through the mind links of passing scouts. They had heard of the light. They had heard of the silver flare asterisk. They see a girl in the king's cloak, Alara said, her eyes scanning the sea of faces. They see the ghost they were told didn't exist. Let them look, Draven growled, his amber eyes flashing with a possessive warning to anyone who stared too long. Let them wonder. They will learn soon enough that the moon doesn't ask for permission to rise. As they passed through the inner gates, the architecture shifted from rugged stone to refined elegance. Gardens of frost-resistant roses bloomed in the courtyards, their petals a deep blood red against the black stone. Fountains fed by hot springs bubbled with a gentle hiss. They stopped in the great courtyard, where the royal court had assembled. These were the high-ranking alphas of the various territories, the advisors, and the noble families who vied for the king's favor. Among them stood a woman who radiated a different kind of power. She was tall, her hair the color of spun gold, dressed in a gown of midnight blue that matched the iron phalanx's armor. This was High Lady Selene, Draven's cousin, and the woman many expected to eventually take the throne by his side, should he fail to find a fated mate. Draven dismounted first, then reached up to lift Alara down. He didn't set her aside. He kept his arm firmly around her waist, pulling her flush against his side as he faced his court. The silence was deafening. It was the silence of 100 predators trying to process a miracle. "Your Majesty," Selene stepped forward, her voice like silk over glass. Her eyes, a sharp, calculating green, flicked to Alara, then to the silver-tinted hair falling over Alara's shoulders. "The North has clearly changed you. And who is this child? A refugee from the border skirmishes." "This," Draven said, his voice carrying to every corner of the courtyard, "is Alara. She is under my personal protection. She will be housed in the lunar wing, and her word is to be treated as my own." A collective intake of breath swept through the nobles. The lunar wing had been sealed for a century. It was the traditional suite of the Silver Queens of old. "The lunar wing," Selene's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Surely, Draven, that is a bit theatrical for an Omega." Draven stepped forward, the temperature in the courtyard dropping 10 degrees. His aura flared, a crushing weight of dominance that forced the nearest alphas to lower their heads. "She is what she is, Selene," Draven hissed. "And you would do well to remember that even a child can hold a torch that burns a palace down. See to her rooms, now." Alara was led away by a silent troop of servants, but these were not like the ones at Shadow Creek. They didn't look at her with pity or disgust. They looked at her with a terrifying religious awe. The lunar wing was a masterpiece of architecture. The walls were made of white marble veined with silver, and the ceiling was a vast dome of glass that revealed the sky. In the center of the main room was a pool of steaming mineral water, surrounded by plants that only bloomed at night. As the doors closed, Alara finally let go. She sank to her knees on the soft, silk rugs, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "We are in a trap," Luna whispered in her mind. The wolf was packing again, her silver fur bristling. "The walls are beautiful, Alara, but they are still walls. The air here smells of old blood and new lies." "We have no choice," Luna Alara replied, looking at her hands. They were still trembling. "Draven is the only thing standing between us and the Seekers. If we leave this city, we die. If we stay, we belong to him." She walked to the pool and caught her reflection in the water. She didn't recognize the girl staring back. The mud-brown tint of the aconite was completely gone. Her eyes were a haunting, luminous silver blue, and her skin had a faint, pearlescent glow that no amount of scrubbing could hide. She looked like a relic. She looked like a prize. A soft knock at the door startled her. She stood up, pulling the king's mantle tighter around her. "Enter," she said, trying to mimic Draven's tone of command. It was the commander, Marcus. He looked uncomfortable in the refined setting of the lunar wing, his hand resting habitually on the hilt of his sword. "The king has sent a physician," Marcus said, "and a gift." He stepped aside to reveal a group of servants carrying chests of fine silks, furs, and jewelry. But it was the physician who caught Alara's attention, an old man with eyes that looked as though they had seen the birth of the world. "I am Hector," the old man said, bowing low. "I am the keeper of the lore, and I have waited 60 years to see if the stories were true." He walked toward her, and for the first time, Alara didn't feel the need to hide. He wasn't looking at her as a servant or a mate. He was looking at her as a piece of history. "You have used the flare," Hector said, his voice a dry whisper. "Your meridians are scorched, child. The aconite created a dam. And when it broke, the pressure nearly tore your soul apart. You must rest, or the next shift will be your last." "I can't rest," Alara said, looking toward the window. "The Seekers, I saw them." Hector's face paled. "The Shadowhounds, yes, they are the hounds of the eclipse, but they are only the beginning. There are things in the dark far older than hounds, Alara, things that remember the taste of silver blood." He reached into his robe and pulled out a small, crystal vial. It contained a liquid that shimmered like liquid moonlight. "This is not poison," Hector said. "This is essence. It will help your body adapt to the power. But be warned, the more you take, the more the wolf will want to stay. Soon, the girl Alara will be nothing but a memory, and only the queen will remain." Alara took the vial, the cool glass vibrating in her palm. "Is that what Draven wants?" she asked, "for the girl to disappear?" Hector looked at her with a pity that cut deeper than Chloe's claws ever had. "The king is a man of shadows, Alara, and shadows always seek the light. He doesn't want to destroy you. He wants to be saved by you, but a savior is rarely a free woman." As Hector left, Alara stood alone in the center of her beautiful, silver cage. She looked at the silks and the jewels, the symbols of a life she had never dared to dream of. She walked to the window and looked up at the black spire, the highest tower of the citadel, where Draven's quarters were located. She could see his silhouette against the firelight, a lone king looking out over a kingdom that was about to go to war for a girl he had found in the dirt. She opened the vial and drank. The essence was like drinking stars. It was cold, then hot, then a feeling of such immense peace that her knees buckled. "Sleep, little ghost," Draven's voice echoed in her mind, softer now, almost a lullaby. "The sun is coming, and with it the vultures, but for tonight, you are mine." Alara drifted into a dreamless sleep, unaware that beneath the citadel, in the deep vaults where the sun never touched, an ancient seal was beginning to crack. The silver wolf had returned, and the earth itself was preparing to wake up. The lunar wing is built from moonstone, a rare mineral that amplifies the abilities of the silver line. For Alara, being in this room is like being plugged into a battery. It will accelerate her healing, but it also makes her signal much louder to those who know how to listen. The transformation of the ghost into the queen began with the cleaning of the sins. That was what the head made. A stern woman named Greta with a scar running through her eyebrow, called the ritualistic bathing required for the king's banquet. Alara stood naked in the center of the marble pool, the steam rising around her like a protective veil. For the first time in 10 years, she saw her body without the layer of grime and shame she had worn like a second skin. She was lean, her muscles defined by a decade of hard labor, but there was a new luminosity to her flesh. Where the aconite had made her skin look like parchment, the essence Hector gave her had turned it into something akin to pearl, translucent, glowing with a faint, inner light that pulsed in time with her heartbeat. "The scars are fatting," Greta remarked, her voice softening as she scrubbed Alara's back with a sponge soaked in crushed white lilies and sea salt. Alara looked down at her arms. The whip marks from the Shadow Creek enforcers and the jagged lines from Chloe's claws were indeed dissolving, replaced by smooth, flawless skin. Only one mark remained, a faint, silver-white crescent moon on her shoulder blade, her birthright. "They aren't fatting," Alara whispered, watching the water ripple. "They're being rewritten." After the bath, she was draped in silk. It was a gown the color of a winter sky, deep midnight blue that faded into shimmering silver at the hem. It was backless, revealing the glowing moon mark, and the sleeves were long and sheer, clinging to her arms like mist. Around her neck, they fastened a collar of obsidian and moonstone, the king's colors. It was heavy, a constant reminder of the weight of the man who now claimed her. "You look like a goddess," one of the younger maids whispered, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and adoration. "Or a ghost come back to life." "A ghost is safer," Alara replied, staring at her reflection. Her eyes were no longer human. They were twin mirrors of the celestial abyss. The walk to the great dining hall was a gauntlet. The iron phalanx lined the corridors, their black armor polished to a mirror finish. As Alara passed, each warrior slammed their fist against their chest in a rhythmic, booming salute. Thump, thump, thump. It was the sound of a heartbeat. It was the sound of an army acknowledging their heartbeat. The great dining hall was an amphitheater of power. A massive table of weirwood, white as bone, stretched down the center. At its head sat Draven. He was dressed in black leather and velvet, a silver crown of thorns resting on his brow. To his left was an empty chair, draped in white wolf fur. As Alara entered, the roar of conversation died instantly. The air became so thick with the sense of competing alphas, cedar, spice, musk, and old blood, that it was like walking into a physical wall. Draven stood up, his amber eyes locked onto hers, and for a second the entire room disappeared. Through the bond, she felt his breath hitch. She felt the raw, primal hunger of Nero, who wanted to leap over the table and claim her in front of everyone. "Alara," he said, his voice a low, vibrating chord that commanded silence. He walked down the length of the table, ignoring the shocked expressions of the high alphas. He reached her and took her hand, his fingers warm and rough against her skin. He didn't lead her to the table. He escorted her as if she were made of the very starlight she represented. He seated her at his left, the seat of the queen. "Your Majesty," a voice rang out, dripping with honeyed poison. It was High Alpha Silas of the Southern Reach, a man with a face like a hawk and a reputation for cruelty that rivaled Draven's. "We were told you found a servant in the north. We were not told you intended to seat a wolfless girl at the table of the great houses. Is this a joke, or has the winter frost finally reached your brain?" The room went cold. Silence stretched, taut as a bowstring. Draven didn't look at Silas. He picked up a chalice of dark wine and took a slow, deliberate sip. "Silas," Draven said quietly, "you have always had a talent for speaking when you should be listening." "I speak for the law," Silas countered, standing up. "The silver line is dead. The girls of that line were hunted for a reason. They were aberrations. They were weak. If this girl is indeed one of them, she belongs in a lab, not on a throne. And if she is just an Omega playing dress-up, she belongs in the kitchens." Alara felt the flare stir in her chest, a low, humming vibration of silver heat. "Quiet, Luna," she whispered in her mind. "He insults the moon," Luna growled back. "Let me show him the dark side of our light." "Silas is right about one thing," High Lady Selene said from her seat further down the table. She looked radiant in her crimson silk, but her eyes were twin daggers of green envy. "The silver wolf was a myth, a story told to children. If Alara is truly what you claim, Draven, let her prove it. Let her shift, now." "Yes," another alpha barked. "Show us the light or show us the door." Draven's hand tightened on the arm of his chair. The stone began to crack under his grip. He was about to unleash a command that would likely shatter the windows, but Alara reached out and placed her hand over his. Her touch was like a cooling rain on a forest fire. Draven froze, his gaze snapping to hers. "I am not a dog to be performed on command," Alara said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it had a strange, harmonic quality that made everyone's ears ring. "And I am not a servant of the high houses." She stood up, her blue-silver gown shimmering like a waterfall. She looked at Silas, then at Selene. "You want proof?" she asked. She picked up a silver steak knife from the table. Before anyone could react, she drew the blade across her own palm. Red blood welled up, but as it hit the air, it began to change. It didn't drip. It floated in small, glowing spheres of crimson and silver. She held her hand out over the center of the table. Where the blood touched the weirwood, the dead white wood began to groan asterisk. In front of the stunned eyes of the alphas, green shoots began to erupt from the table. Tiny, white flowers bloomed in seconds, their scent filling the hall with the fragrance of 1,000 springs. "Life," The silver wolf was the bringer of life. The silver line was not hunted because they were weak, Alara said, her eyes glowing with a terrifying, ancient wisdom. They were hunted because they are the only ones who can take back what you have stolen. I am Alara, the last of the Moonborn, and I do not sit at this table because the king allows it. I sit here because the moon demands it. Silas fell back into his chair, his face the color of ash. Seleni's glass shattered in her hand, wine spilling like blood onto her dress. Draven looked at Alara, a fierce, terrifying pride burning in his eyes. He stood up and raised his chalice. "To the Silver Queen," he roared. "To the Silver Queen." The iron phalanx echoed from the walls, their voices a thunder that shook the citadel to its foundations. But as the court toasted, Alara caught a glimpse of Hector at the back of the room. The old physician wasn't cheering. He was looking at the flowers growing from the table with an expression of pure dread. Because he knew what the others didn't. To give life, the silver wolf had to give asterisk of herself asterisk. And the flowers weren't just blooming. They were white because they were feeding on the very essence that kept Alara's soul anchored to her body. The more she proved her power, the faster she was dying. Unlike alphas who use power to destroy, silver wolves use power to manifest. Every miracle Alara performs, healing, growth, the flare uses her soul thread. If she uses too much before her body is fully adapted to the shift, the thread will snap, leaving her a hollow, a body without a spirit. The fragrance of the weirwood flowers was still heavy in the air, cloyingly sweet, like a funeral shroud made of lilies, when the heavy obsidian doors of the dining hall were not opened, but shattered. The sound was like a mountain cracking in half. Shards of black glass sprayed across the floor, skidding toward the feet of the high alphas. Through the settling dust, a figure stumbled into the hall. It was a scout from the iron phalanx, but his armor, once midnight chrome, was now melted and warped as if he had walked through the heart of a forge. My king," the soldier gasped, his voice a wet rattle. Draven was over the table in a single, blur-like motion, his boots hitting the stone with a thunderous crack. He caught the soldier before he could collapse. Nero's growl vibrated in Draven's chest, a low-frequency warning that made the wine in the glasses ripple. "Report Kale," Draven commanded, his hands steadying the dying man. "The border, the White Pass," Kale coughed, and instead of red blood, a viscous, violet smoke escaped his lips. It wasn't an army, it was the silence. The room went cold. The high alphas, who had been ready to bicker over Alara's lineage moments ago, now looked at one another with naked terror. The silence was the nickname for the *** order of the Eclipse's * elite assassins, warriors who had traded their wolves for the ability to move through the void. Kale's eyes rolled back, his skin turning the color of bruised plums. "They have," the message. With a final, agonizing jerk, the soldier's body went still. But he did not stay dead. His mouth unhinged, stretching wider than any human jaw should, and a voice erupted from his throat, a voice that sounded like 1,000 dead leaves scraping together. "Alpha King, child of the moon." The voice didn't just fill the room, it crawled into their ears like insects. Alara felt Luna recoil within her, the silver wolf whimpering at the sheer unnaturalness of the sound. "The cycle is broken. The balance is an insult. You have brought a star into a world of shadows, and for that, the sky must be purged. We are the Eclipse, and we come to claim what was never yours to hide." Suddenly, the flowers that Alara had grown from the weirwood table began to turn black. They didn't wither. They rotted in a matter of seconds, turning into a foul-smelling sludge that hissed against the wood. The message continued. 7 days, Draven. Hand over the relic, or we will turn your citadel into a tomb. Every pup, every elder, every wolf in your line will be unmade. The silver wolf belongs to the void. With a final, violet flash, Kale's body disintegrated into ash, leaving nothing behind but a scorched mark on the floor and the lingering scent of ozone and rot. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. All eyes turned toward Draven, then slowly, with predatory suspicion, shifted to Alara. "They're coming for her," High Alpha Silas whispered, his fear turning into a weapon. "The Order hasn't moved in a century. They've stayed in the shadows because there was nothing worth hunting. Now we are all targets because you brought a stray into our walls." "A stray," Draven's voice was dangerously quiet. He turned, his amber eyes now fully gold, the pupils slitted like a beast's. "You heard the message, Silas. They didn't call her a stray. They called her the child of the moon." "It doesn't matter what they call her," Selene shrieked, her composure finally breaking. "Draven, look at what happened to Kale. They are using void magic. We cannot fight the silence. If you keep her here, you are signing our death warrants. Give her to them. Let them take the relic and leave us in peace." Elara felt the room closing in. The gilded cage was no longer a metaphor. She saw the calculation in the eyes of the high alphas. To them, she wasn't a queen. She was a bargaining chip. A beautiful, glowing sacrifice that could buy them safety. "They will betray us," Luna hissed, her voice a sharp silver blade. "They are sheep in wolves' clothing, Elara. Let us show them the price of betrayal." "Enough," Draven roared. The shockwave of his voice sent a tremor through the floorboards. He walked toward Elara, his presence so immense that even the air seemed to bow before him. He reached her and took her hand, the one she had cut to prove her power. He raised it high for the court to see. "The silver wolf is the heart of the pack," Draven declared, his gaze sweeping the room like a scythe. "And the heart does not negotiate with a cancer that tries to eat it. You talk of safety. You think the order will stop with her. They want the light extinguished so they can rule the dark. If we give her up, we are not buying peace. We are buying our own extinction." He leaned in, his face inches from Silas's. "I am the Alpha King. My word is the only law that matters. If any man or woman in this room attempts to touch her, to bargain for her, or to speak of her to the order, I will not just kill you. I will wipe your entire bloodline from the histories. Do I make myself clear?" One by one, the alphas lowered their heads. But Elara saw the way Selene's fingers gripped her skirts. She saw the way Silas looked at the door. The king had their obedience, but he did not have their loyalty. Hours later, the banquet hall had been cleared, leaving only the scent of ash and the blackened table. Draven led Elara up the winding stairs of the black spire, his grip on her hand never loosening. They reached his private chambers, a sprawling room of dark stone, heavy furs, and a balcony that overlooked the entire kingdom. The fire in the hearth was roaring, but the room felt cold. Draven released her and walked to the balcony, his back to her. The moonlight hit his shoulders, making the scars there look like silver maps. "They're right, aren't they?" Elara asked, her voice small in the vast room. Draven didn't turn. "About what?" "About the danger. I am a target. Every second I spend in this city, I am putting your people in the path of the void." She walked toward him, her silk gown rustling on the stone. "Maybe I should go. I can draw them away. I can lead them into the deep mountains where—" Draven spun around so fast she didn't see him move. He grabbed her by the shoulders, his fingers digging into the silk. "You are not going anywhere," he growled. The amber in his eyes was turbulent, a storm of protective rage and something else, something softer, something that looked like desperation. "You spent 10 years hiding in a cellar, Elara. You think I'm going to let you spend the rest of your life running through the dark?" "Draven, you don't understand. I understand that for the first time in my life, my wolf is quiet when you are near," he whispered, his voice breaking. He dropped his hands from her shoulders to her waist, pulling her into his heat. "I spent my youth killing. I spent my reign building a cage for myself out of duty and blood. And then I found you, a girl with the sun in her eyes and a soul that smells like the first day of spring." He pressed his forehead against hers. "I'm not protecting a relic, Elara. I'm protecting my mate." The word hit her like a physical blow. Mate, the fated bond. She had felt it in the carriage, felt it in the blood taste, but hearing him say it, here, in the shadow of a war, made it real. "You knew," she whispered. "Nero knew the moment he smelled you in that hall," Draven said, his hand coming up to cup her cheek. His thumb traced the line of her jaw. "But I wanted you to choose me. I didn't want the bond to be your new master. I wanted the girl who scrubbed the floors to look at the king and see a man." Elara looked up into his amber eyes. For the first time, she didn't see a predator. She saw a partner, a man who was willing to fight the void itself just to hear her heart beat. She reached up, her fingers tangling in the hair at the nape of his neck. She pulled him down, and as their lips met, the bond finally snapped into place. It wasn't a gentle feeling. It was an explosion of gold and silver. Elara saw his life, the cold nights, the battles, the loneliness of the crown. And he saw hers, the fire, the aconite, the silence. They were no longer two separate beings. They were a binary star, two lights circling a common center. But as the passion of the bond flared, a shadow flickered at the edge of Elara's vision. Through the window, far below in the city, she saw a single violet spark, then another. The 7 days had not yet begun. The order of the eclipse was already inside the walls. "They are here," Luna whispered, her fur standing on end. The war hadn't just come to the citadel. It had come for the king's bedroom. The violet smoke that escaped Kale's lungs is known as ether blight. It is a necrotic energy that consumes the internal magic of a werewolf. For a normal wolf, it is fatal. For a silver wolf, it is a poison that turns their own healing power against them. If Elara is infected, her light will literally burn her from the inside out. Chapter 3, The Night of Violet Petals. The kiss was supposed to be a seal, a vow of protection and the final locking of their souls. But as the bond snapped into place, the air in the king's bedchamber didn't just warm with passion, it curdled. Elara pulled back, her silver eyes widening as the radiance within her flared in warning. The sensory overload she had been experiencing since her shift suddenly crystallized into a single, sharp point of focus. The smell of cedar and storm from Draven was being strangled by something else. It was the scent of dead flowers and cold ash. "Draven," she whispered, her hand clutching his tunic. "The shadows. They aren't outside the window, they're in the walls." Draven's transition from lover to king was instantaneous. His eyes bled from amber to a predatory gold, and his posture shifted into a low, lethal crouch. He didn't ask her to explain. He trusted the bond. "Nero out," he growled. Usually, a shift of that magnitude would take several seconds, but Draven was a king of the old blood. His body simply tore itself apart and rebuilt into the massive black wolf in a heartbeat. He stood between Elara and the heavy oak doors, his hackles raised, his teeth bared in a silent snarl. Then, the floorboards began to weep. A thick, violet liquid, looking like melted silk, began to seep through the cracks in the stone. It didn't pool, it rose, coiling into the air like smoke. From the violet mist, 3 figures emerged. They were tall, impossibly thin, and draped in tattered robes that seemed to be made of literal shadows. They had no faces, only smooth, pale masks of bone with a single violet rune etched into the forehead. The silence. They didn't speak. They didn't growl. They moved with a terrifying, synchronized twitchiness. One of them raised a hand, and the violet mist coalesced into a jagged blade of solidified void. "Protect the heart," Draven's voice thundered in Elara's mind, the link now a frantic, pulsing tether. "Stay behind me, Elara. Do not touch the mist." Nero launched himself at the first assassin. The clash was unlike any battle Elara had seen. When Nero's teeth sank into the shadowcloth, there was no blood, only a sound like screaming wind. The assassin didn't die. It dissipated and reformed 10 feet away, its violet blade humming as it sliced through the air, narrowly missing Nero's throat. Elara backed toward the balcony, her heart hammering. She felt the silver wolf, Luna, packing frantically within her. "They are hollow," Luna cried out. "There is no soul to bite, no life to quench. We must burn them with the light, or they will drink us dry." Elara raised her hands. She had used the flare once, and it had nearly killed her. Hector's warning echoed in her mind. "Your meridians are scorched. The next shift will be your last." But as she watched the second and third assassins flank Draven, their violet blades poised to strike his exposed sides, she knew she didn't have a choice. She couldn't watch another family die in the dark. "No," she screamed. She didn't shift fully. She didn't have the time. Instead, she reached for the celestial thread Hector had spoken of. She visualized the moon, not as a rock in the sky, but as a source of pure, purifying fire. She thrust her hands forward. A beam of silver light, as thin as a needle but as bright as a dying star, shot from her fingertips. It struck the assassin on the left, piercing the bone mask. The creature didn't just dissipate this time. It shrieked, a high, piercing sound that shattered every glass ornament in the room, and burst into white flames. The light acted like a solvent, dissolving the shadow cloth and the voidessence until nothing but a handful of gray ash remained. But the effort cost her. Elara collapsed to one knee, her vision swimming in red and gold. A sharp, copper taste filled her mouth. "I'm bleeding," she realized, inside. The remaining two assassins paused. The runes on their foreheads began to glow a furious, dark purple. They realized the relic wasn't just a prize, she was a threat. They ignored Draven, turning their faceless heads toward her. "Elara, run!" Draven's mental voice was a roar of agony as he took a violet blade to the shoulder to stay between her and the attackers. But Elara wasn't looking at the assassins anymore. She was looking at the door. The door to the king's chambers swung open. It wasn't more assassins. It was the maids, Greta and the young girl who had admired Elara's gown. They had heard the noise and come to help, unaware that they were walking into a slaughter. "Get out!" Elara screamed, but it was too late. One of the assassins flickered. In a heartbeat, it was behind the girls. Its shadow hand reached out, the violet smoke beginning to coil around the young maid's throat. "Please," the girl sobbed, her eyes wide with terror. Elara looked at the assassin. Then she looked at the king, who was struggling to fight off the third shadow while his shoulder hung limp, the void poison already turning his black fur to gray. She was the Silver Queen. She was the balance, and the balance didn't allow the innocent to be sacrificed for the powerful. "Luna," Elara whispered. "Everything, give them everything." "It will break us," the wolf warned, but there was a fierce, prideful joy in her voice. "But we will go out as a sun." Elara stood up. She didn't just glow, she ignited. The room disappeared in a wash of blinding white. This wasn't the flare, the uncontrolled explosion. This was the aureole. It was a localized field of pure lunar energy. Elara walked toward the assassin holding the girl, each of her footsteps leaving a burning, silver print on the stone. The assassin tried to strike, but its violet blade disintegrated the moment it entered the aureole's radius. Elara reached out and grabbed the shadow creature's wrist. The light traveled up its arm like a fuse. The creature didn't even have time to shriek before it was vaporized. Elara turned to the third assassin, her eyes now twin furnaces of white fire. She didn't use a beam. She simply spoke a single word in the high tongue of the Moonborn, a language she hadn't known she knew. Kalinar returned to nothing. The air in the room rippled. The remaining assassin simply ceased to exist. Not ash, not smoke, it was deleted from reality. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the heavy, wet breathing of the king. The aureole faded. Elara stood in the center of the room, her midnight blue gown shredded, her skin so pale it was almost blue. She turned to look at Greta and the maid. They were safe, huddled in the doorway. Then she turned to Draven. Nero had shifted back. Draven lay on the floor, his shoulder a ruin of black blood and violet veins. He was shaking, his eyes unfocused. "Draven," Elara whispered. She stumbled toward him. But her legs were no longer hers to command. The soul thread was frayed to its last strand. She felt the cold of the void trying to creep into the holes she had left in her own spirit. She reached him, collapsing across his chest. She pressed her glowing hand to his wound. Don't die," she gasped. "The king cannot fall." She poured the last of her light into him. She felt the void poison fighting her, biting at her fingers, but she didn't stop. She pushed until she felt his heart steady, until the violet veins in his shoulder turned back to the bronze of his skin. Draven's eyes cleared. He looked at her, his hand reaching up to catch her falling head. "Elara, no, stop, you've given too much, stop." But she couldn't stop. The light was gone, the girl was gone. As the darkness finally took her, Elara heard a sound from the balcony. It wasn't an assassin. It was a crow, a large black crow with violet eyes. It sat on the railing, watching her with a terrifying, intelligent gaze. "The first petal has fallen," the crow croaked in the silence's voice. 6 days remain, King of Ash. 6 days until the moon goes dark forever." Draven let out a roar of grief and rage that shook the entire citadel, but Elara didn't hear it. She was already falling into the white abyss. The aureole is the most advanced defensive technique of the silver line. It creates a hallowed ground where void magic cannot exist. However, because it requires the wolf to project their soul outside their body, it leaves the physical heart vulnerable. To save the servants and the king, Alara has effectively emptied her vessel. The world was no longer stone and silk. It was a vast, echoing chamber of frost. In the white abyss, Alara felt nothing. No pain from her scorched meridians, no weight of the obsidian collar, no heat from the king's touch. She was a single spark drifting in a blizzard, her consciousness thinning like smoke. Far away, she could hear the muffled sound of a heartbeat, asterisk thump thump, thump thump asterisk, but it wasn't hers. It was the rhythm of the citadel, the pulse of a kingdom she had accidentally set on fire. "Wake up, little ghost." The voice wasn't Draven's. It was ancient, layered with the echoes of 1,000 years. A woman appeared in the mist, tall, with fur-lined robes and eyes that held the same silver-blue fire as Alara's. "You have spent your life hiding from your light," the woman said, her voice a soft chime. "But you cannot save a king by dying in his arms. The moon does not fall so the earth can breathe. They must turn together." "I am empty," Alara whispered, or thought she did. "There is nothing left to give." "Then take," the ancestor replied. "Take from the mountain, take from the bond. A queen is not a well to be drained, she is a channel for the stars." Back in the physical world, the king's solar was a scene from a nightmare. Draven sat on the floor, cradling Alara's limp body, his hands glowing with a faint, reflected silver from her skin. He was a man possessed, his amber eyes wild, his aura so violent that the stone walls were beginning to crack. Hector burst into the room, followed by Marcus and a team of healers. The old physician took one look at Alara, her skin almost translucent, her pulse a ghost of a vibration, and turned ashen. "Out, everyone out," Hector screamed, his usual calm replaced by a frantic, jagged energy. "Save her, Hector," Draven growled, his voice dropping into the guttural register of the wolf. "Save her, or I will dismantle this mountain brick by brick." "I cannot save what isn't here, Draven," Hector snapped, dropping to his knees beside them. He pulled out a leather roll of needles made of star iron. "She has projected her soul. She used the aureole without a tether. Her spirit is drifting in the void, and if we don't call her back in the next hour, her body will become a vessel for the very shadows she just destroyed." Hector looked at Draven, his eyes pleading. "There is only one way, the blood bridge asterisk asterisk. You must go into the link. You must find her in the dark and pull her back. But if you fail, if you get lost in her light, neither of you will wake up." "Do it," Draven said without a second of hesitation. Hector didn't waste time. He took 2 long star iron needles and drove them into the pulse points of Alara's wrists. He took 2 more and drove them into Draven's. He then took a bowl of pure mountain water and mixed it with a drop of essence and a drop of Draven's blood. "Drink," Hector commanded. Draven drank, the world tilted. The solar faded away. Draven found himself standing on a bridge made of frozen light, suspended over an infinite black sea. Far in the distance, a single, flickering spark was being pulled toward a vortex of violet smoke. "Alara," he roared in the mind link. The spark paused. "Draven," her voice was a thin thread of silk. "It's so cold here. I think I'm supposed to let go." "No," Draven sprinted across the bridge of light, his feet leaving burning black prints. "You are the Silver Queen. You are my mate. I did not find you in that attic just to lose you to a bunch of faceless shadows. Look at me." He reached the edge of the light. The violet vortex was huge now, a swirling maw of nothingness. He reached out his hand, his fingers straining toward the fading spark. "Give me your hand, Alara. Fight for the girl who scrubbed the floors. Fight for the wolf who wants to run. Fight for me." The spark hesitated, then surged. In the center of the violet storm, Alara's form solidified. She reached out, her fingers brushing his. The moment they touched, the binary star effect ignited. A shockwave of gold and silver blasted the vortex apart, shattering the silence of the void. Back in the solar, Alara's eyes snapped open. She let out a jagged, gasping breath, her lungs burning as if she were breathing fire. Draven collapsed beside her, his forehead resting against hers, both of them drenched in sweat and shaking with the aftershocks of the ritual. "She's back," Hector whispered, leaning back with a sigh that seemed to age him 10 years. But there was no time for relief. Marcus, the commander, stepped forward, his face a mask of cold fury. He was holding a small, crumpled piece of parchment he had found in the hallway during the chaos. "My king," Marcus said, his voice trembling with suppressed rage. "While you were in the void, we found this. It was dropped by one of the Silents during their retreat." Draven took the paper. His eyes scanned the runes, and as he read, the air in the room grew so cold that the water in Hector's bowl froze solid. The parchment was a map of the Citadel's secret tunnels that only the inner circle of the High Alphas knew about. At the bottom was a seal. The seal of the Southern Reach ***. "Silas," Alara whispered, the name tasting like poison on her tongue. "He didn't just insult you at the table," Draven said, his voice a low, terrifying promise of death. "He gave them the keys to my bedroom. He tried to trade your soul for his own seat at a table that won't exist in a week." Draven stood up. He wasn't the lover anymore. He wasn't the man who had just wept in the void. He was the executioner of crowns. "Marcus," Draven commanded, "seal the city. No one leaves, no one enters, and bring me Silas. Do not bring him to the cells, bring him to the courtyard." "Draven, wait," Alara said, reaching for his hand. She was weak, but the essence was already beginning to knit her spirit back together. The message said 7 days. If you kill a High Alpha now, the other houses will panic. They'll think you've gone feral. Draven looked down at her, his amber eyes glowing with a dark, unyielding fire. "Let them think it," he said. "They need to learn that there are 2 things you do not touch in this world, the king's crown and the king's light." He turned and strode out of the room, his cloak billowing like a storm cloud. The sun was just beginning to touch the peaks of the mountains when the High Alphas were summoned to the central courtyard. They stood in the freezing dawn, shivering in their silks, watching as the iron phalanx formed a circle of black steel. In the center of the circle stood a block of obsidian. Silas was dragged forward by 2 warriors. He wasn't arrogant anymore. He was a whimpering mess, his hawk-like face smeared with tears and snot. "Draven, it was a mistake," Silas shrieked. "They promised they would only take the girl. They said the rest of us would be spared. I did it for the pack. I did it for the survival of the species." Draven stepped into the circle. He didn't have a sword. He didn't need one. "You traded a queen for a lie," Draven said. He looked at the other alphas, Selene, who was white as a sheet, and the others who had whispered about handing over the relic. "Let this be the only warning you receive," Draven announced, his voice carrying to the highest towers of the citadel. "The Silver Wolf is the heart of this kingdom. To betray her is to betray the sun, and without the sun, we all die in the dark." He reached out and grabbed Silas by the throat. With a single, brutal surge of alpha power, he didn't just kill the man, he crushed the wolf within him. Silas's eyes went dull, his spirit extinguished before his body even hit the ground. Draven dropped the corpse like a piece of trash. 7 days, Draven said, looking toward the north, where the violet sparks were growing into a cloud. "We have 7 days to prepare for the end of the world. I suggest you start sharpening your teeth." He turned and walked back toward the black spire, leaving the High Alphas in a silence that was far more terrifying than any roar. The blood bridge is a soul tether. By saving Alara, Draven has permanently linked his life force to hers. If she dies, his heart will stop. If he falls, her light will fade. They are no longer just mates, they are a symbiotic entity. The execution of Silas had left a heavy, iron-scented tension over the citadel. While the High Alphas retreated to their quarters to whisper in the dark, Draven remained a shadow on the battlements, watching the horizon. But for Alara, the battle was no longer outside the walls. It was within her marrow. 2 days had passed since the ritual. Her body was a map of contradictions. Her skin was cool to the touch, yet she felt as though she were standing in the center of a furnace. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the violet vortex of the void, and the ancient woman's voice echoed in her mind. "A queen is not a well to be drained. She is a channel for the stars." She was sitting in the lunar wing when Hector entered. carrying a heavy object wrapped in a cloth of aged, silver-spun silk. "The king is preparing the armies," Hector said, his voice weary. "But an army of wolves cannot kill a shadow. Only a shadow can kill a shadow, or a light so pure it leaves no room for the dark." He placed the object on the marble table. With a reverent hand, he pulled back the silk. It was a mirror, but not a mirror of glass. It was a circular plate of lumen steel, an alloy of silver and fallen stars that had been lost to the world for a millennium. Its surface was not reflective. It was a swirling pool of liquid mercury that seemed to breathe. "This is the asterisk eye of the moon asterisk asterisk," Hector whispered. "It is not a relic to be worshipped, Alara. It is a lens. The Order doesn't want to steal it. They want to break it. If they shatter this, the connection between the silver line and the source is severed forever. You will become just another wolf, and the world will fall into the long night." Alara reached out, her fingers hovering over the liquid surface. The mercury surged toward her touch, reaching out like a living thing. "How do I use it?" she asked. "You don't use it," Hector replied. "You let it use you. You must look into it and see not what you are, but what you were meant to be. You must find the asterisk asterisk celestial language asterisk." The training was a brutal exercise in spiritual endurance. For hours, Alara sat before the eye, forced to maintain the aureole while Hector threw nullstones, black rocks infused with void energy, at her. If her focus wavered for a second, the stone would pierce her light and strike her flesh, leaving a bruise that felt like ice. "Again," Hector commanded. "The Order will not wait for you to find your center. They will strike when you are tired, when you are bleeding, when you are grieving." By the 4th hour, Alara was shaking. The silver light around her was flickering, her breath coming in ragged gasps. I can't. My soul feels like it's fraying." "Then let it fray," a new voice boomed. Draven stood in the doorway. He had stripped off his royal furs, wearing only his training leathers. His shoulder, though healed, bore a jagged silver scar from the assassin's blade. He walked toward her, his aura flaring, not in a way that crushed her, but in a way that challenged her. "The girl in the attic survived on scraps and silence," Draven said, his eyes burning gold. "She was strong because she had to be, but the queen must be strong because she chooses asterisk to be. Do not fight the power, Alara. Stop trying to contain the ocean in a cup. Be the ocean." He shifted, not into the wolf, but into the partial, a state of terrifying power where his claws elongated and his eyes became pure amber fire, but he remained on 2 legs. He lunged at her. The attack was real. He wasn't a teacher, he was a predator. Alara's instincts took over. She didn't think, she reacted. She looked into the eye of the moon, and for a split second, the liquid mercury reflected a version of her that wore a crown of white flames. "Kalinar," she whispered. The light didn't just flash, it solidified. A shield of geometric silver patterns erupted around her. When Draven's claws hit the shield, the sound wasn't a thud, but a musical note, a high, pure C-sharp that resonated through the entire tower. The force of the impact sent a shockwave through the room, knocking Hector off his feet. Draven was thrown back, skidding across the marble floor. He stood up, wiping a trail of blood from his lip. He wasn't angry. He was grinning, a savage, beautiful smile. "There she is," he whispered. "There is my moon." By the evening of the 6th day, the atmosphere in the citadel had reached a breaking point. The sky had turned a bruised, sickly violet, and the wind carried the sound of 1,000 whispering voices. The people of the lower city had been moved into the volcanic tunnels for safety, leaving the streets of the citadel a ghost town of black stone. Alara stood on the highest balcony of the black spire, the eye of the moon now fused to a silver breastplate she wore over her gown. She felt different. The fear was still there, but it was a cold, sharpenable thing. Draven joined her, his presence a warm anchor in the freezing night. He stood behind her, his arms wrapping around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. "The scouts report the cloud is 10 miles out," Draven said softly. "They'll be here by midnight." "Draven," Alara said, turning in his arms. She looked into his eyes, seeing the man behind the king. "If I can't do this, if I fail." "You won't," he said, his voice an absolute truth. Because I will be the shadow that holds the world still while you burn. And if we fall together. My soul is tied to yours, Alara. I was a king of a dead world until I found you. I would rather die as your mate than live another 100 years as a lonely god." He leaned down and kissed her, a slow, deep kiss that tasted of tea and destiny. But as they broke apart, the bells of the citadel began to toll. Clang, clang, clang. It wasn't the sound of an army approaching. It was the sound of the gates being opened from the inside. "The traitors," Alara hissed, her eyes snapping to the courtyard below. High Lady Selene stood at the great gate, her hand on the lever. Behind her, a dozen alphas from the minor houses stood with their weapons drawn. They weren't fighting the silence. They were welcoming them. "Draven," Selene's voice was amplified by magic, screaming up at the spire. "The Order has promised us life. They only want the relic. We will not die for your obsession." From the violet clouds above, the first of the high assassins began to descend. They didn't fall, they floated down like petals of a dying flower. There weren't 3 this time, there were hundreds. And in the center of the swarm was a figure that made even Draven's blood run cold. A man in white robes, his face a skull of polished silver, the asterisk Grand Inquisitor of the Eclipse. "The time of the sun is over," the Inquisitor's voice echoed, cold as the void. "Bring us the silver wolf, or we will turn this mountain into an altar of bone." Draven looked at Alara. He reached for his heavy black sword, the obsidian blade humming with Nero's rage. "Stay here," Draven commanded. "Keep the eye active. I'm going to go remind my cousin why I am the king." "No," Alara said, her hand moving to the eye of the moon on her chest. The liquid mercury began to glow with a blinding, rhythmic light. "We go together, the shadow and the light." The silver wolf and the black king stepped onto the edge of the balcony. Below them, the citadel was a sea of violet flames and black steel. The 7 days were up. The war for the soul of the world had begun. Chapter 4, The Eclipse of Spire. The descent from the black spire was not a walk. It was a fall into chaos. Draven didn't use the stairs. He grabbed Alara, his arm a band of iron around her waist, and leaped from the balcony. Midair, the transformation took him not into the wolf, but into a monstrous hybrid form of shadow and sinew. Large, leathery wings of solidified darkness erupted from his back, catching the wind just enough to slow their plummet. They hit the flagstones of the courtyard like a meteor. The impact shattered the stone beneath them, sending a shockwave that knocked back the approaching traitors. Draven stood up, his height now nearly 7 feet, his skin covered in a fine, obsidian fur. He let out a roar that wasn't just a sound. It was a physical force that extinguished the torches in the courtyard. "Selene," Draven's voice was a tectonic plate grinding against another. "You opened my gates to the void. You traded your blood for ash." Selene stood behind a line of turncoat alphas, her face a mask of panicked defiance. "I did what was necessary, Draven. You've been blinded by a ghost. The Order is eternal. You are just a man with a crown." "I am the king of the north," Draven hissed, his claws extending 6 inches, dripping with dark energy. "And the north never forgets." The Grand Inquisitor descended from the sky, landing softly atop the obsidian execution block. His silver skull mask reflected the violet clouds above. He didn't carry a sword. He carried a staff made of human vertebrae, topped with a pulsing violet gem. "The relic," the Inquisitor whispered, his voice vibrating in Alara's teeth. "Hand over the eye, child of the moon, and I will grant your king a quick death. Refuse, and I will show you why the silver line was extinguished." Alara stepped forward from behind Draven. The eye of the moon asterisk on her breastplate was no longer swirling. It had become a steady, blinding beam of white light that pierced the violet gloom. "The silver line wasn't extinguished," Alara said, her voice carrying the strange, echoing resonance of her ancestors. "We were just waiting for the world to get dark enough that you could see us coming." She slammed her palm against the eye. The silver tide erupted. It wasn't a flare or a dome. It was a liquid wave of lunar energy that flowed across the ground. Where it touched the turncoat wolves, it froze them in place, not with ice, but with a weight of judgment that made their own wolves cower in submission. Where it touched the shadowhounds and the silence, they vanished. "Kill them," Selene screamed, pointing at Alara. "Kill the girl and the king falls." The battle became a blur of silver and violet. Draven was a whirlwind of carnage, his obsidian claws reaping through the ranks of the silence. He fought with a desperate, feral grace, always circling back to Alara, his body acting as a living shield for her. But the Inquisitor was watching. He raised his bone staff, and the violet gem pulsed. "The king is the anchor," the Inquisitor noted. "Break the anchor and the ship drifts into the maw." A bolt of violet lightning shot from the staff. It didn't target Alara. It targeted Draven's wounded shoulder, the spot where the void poison had already weakened his spirit. "Draven, look out," Alara cried. She tried to throw up a shield, but the Inquisitor was faster. The bolt struck Draven square in the chest. He didn't fly back, he stayed upright, but a horrific change came over him. The obsidian fur began to fall out. His eyes turned a dull, milky white. The void wasn't killing him, it was Asterisk hollowing him. Draven fell to his knees, his heavy sword clattering to the stone. "Draven!" Alara ran to him, falling into the blood and ash. She grabbed his face, her glowing hands trying to pour light into his cooling skin. "No, no, Nero, wake up! Draven, stay with me!" "He is gone, little ghost," the Inquisitor mocked, stepping off the block. "The king is a shell. Now give me the eye, or I will use his body as my next vessel." Alara looked at the man she loved. His heart was barely beating. The bond was a jagged, screaming wire in her mind, transmitting nothing but cold, infinite silence. She looked at the eye of the moon. Through the liquid mercury, she saw the final lesson. The eye could save him. It could purge the void from his soul. But the eye was a closed system. To put that much light into Draven, it would have to leave the relic. And once the light was gone, the eye would shatter. If she saved Draven, the world would lose its shield against the long night. The Order of the Eclipse would win the war, even if they lost this battle. Thousands would die. The werewolf race would fall into slavery. But if she used the eye to destroy the Inquisitor and the army, Draven would die. He would be the sacrifice that bought the world another century of light. "The moon does not fall so the earth can breathe," the ancestor's voice whispered in her mind. "But sometimes, the moon must choose which world it wants to light." Alara felt a single, silver tear roll down her cheek. It fell onto the eye of the moon. The mercury turned a deep, burning gold, the color of Draven's eyes. "I am not a well to be drained," Alara whispered, standing up. She didn't look at the Inquisitor. She looked at the sky. "I am the channel." She didn't reach for the light. She reached for the bond Asterisk. She grabbed Draven's hand and pressed it against the eye. She didn't pour the light Asterisk into him. She used his shadow to Asterisk shape it. "Nero," she screamed. "The sun is here, wake up." The eye of the moon didn't shatter. It fused. The silver light of the moonborn and the obsidian shadow of the Alpha King merged into a third power, the Asterisk Eclipse Flame. It was a gray, shimmering fire that didn't just burn, it corrected. Draven's eyes snapped open. They weren't amber anymore. They were a terrifying, swirling mix of silver and gold. He stood up, fueled by Alara's light, and let out a roar that tore the violet clouds from the sky. The Inquisitor stumbled back, his silver mask cracking. "Impossible. The bond cannot hold that much power." "We aren't holding it," Alara said, her hand entwined with Draven's. "We're letting it out." Together they moved. They were a storm of gray fire. Every step they took, the void retreated. Every strike Draven made was backed by Alara's light. They were the twofold king and queen, a legend reborn in the blood of the North. They reached the Inquisitor. Draven grabbed the bone staff and snapped it like a dry twig. Alara placed her hand on the Inquisitor's silver mask. "Return to nothing," she commanded. The Inquisitor didn't even have time to shriek. The eclipse flame swallowed him whole. As the leader fell, the remaining silence and shadowhounds flickered and vanished, their connection to the void severed. The violet clouds broke, revealing a sky filled with stars, real stars, cold and ancient. The courtyard was silent. The traitors had fled into the tunnels or were kneeling in the ash, begging for a mercy they didn't deserve. Draven and Alara stood in the center of the wreckage. The eclipse flame faded, leaving them both human, shivering, and exhausted. The eye of the moon on Alara's chest was dim, its liquid surface still and dark. It had survived, but it was sleeping. Draven turned to her. He was covered in soot, blood, and the remnants of the battle, but he had never looked more like a king. He reached out and pulled her to him, his kiss tasting of victory and salt. "You chose me," he whispered against her lips. "I chose us," she corrected. "The world can have its light, Draven, but it doesn't get to have you." High Lady Selene was brought forward by Marcus, her hands bound in silver chains. She looked at Draven, waiting for the executioner's blow. Draven looked at her, then at the smoking remains of the Inquisitor. "I will not kill you, Selene," Draven said, his voice cold and clear. "That would be too kind. You are banished to the wastes. You will live the rest of your life in the dark you so clearly love. If you ever set foot in the north again, the Silver Queen will not be so merciful." As the guards led the traitors away, the first rays of a true sun began to peek over the Frostfell peaks. Alara looked up at the black spire. It was scarred, broken, and beautiful. She was no longer the girl in the attic. She was no longer the ghost. She was the Silver Wolf, and the north was finally awake. Chapter 5. The Southern Summons. The victory at the Citadel should have been a beginning, a moment for the north to breathe. Instead, it felt like the tightening of a new, more elegant noose. While the soot was still being scrubbed from the basalt floors and the broken glass of the Great Hall replaced, a messenger arrived. This was not a scout in warped armor or a shadowhound of the void. This was a herald of the *** High Council of Alpha's ***, dressed in white silk and riding a horse shod in gold. He did not bow. He stood in the center of the scarred courtyard and unfurled a scroll stamped with the seal of the Great Sun ***, the symbol of the Southern Territories. To Draven, King of the North, and the anomaly known as the Silver Wolf, the herald's voice was high and reedy, cutting through the mountain air. "The High Council acknowledges your victory over the Order of the Eclipse. However, the manifestation of an unsanctioned celestial power is a breach of the Continental Accord. You are summoned to the golden city of Ethelgard to stand before the Tribunal of Elders. Fail to appear, and the South will declare the North a rogue state." Draven, standing on the steps with Alara by his side, gripped the hilt of his sword so hard the leather groaned. "They wait until the blood is dry to show their faces," he hissed. "They aren't afraid of the Order, Draven," Alara whispered, her silver-blue eyes fixed on the herald. "They're afraid of the eclipse flame. They're afraid of ***. Leaving the Citadel was a different kind of pain. This time, Alara was not being dragged away in a cage. She was leaving as a sovereign. The people she had once served now lined the roads, throwing white winter lilies at her horse's feet. But as they traveled south, the world changed. The rugged, honest ice of the north gave way to rolling green hills, humid forests, and air that tasted of honey and rot. The further they went, the more the *** eye of the moon *** on Alara's chest throbbed. It was a rhythmic pulse, a warning. "The South is old," Hector told her as they rode. The physician had insisted on coming, his scrolls of ancient lore tucked into his saddlebags. "They have forgotten what it means to struggle. To them, power is something to be manicured like a garden. You and the king, you are a wildfire." They reached Ethelgard on the 5th day. It was a city of white stone and gold leaf, built around a massive sundial that served as the council's throne room. Unlike the Citadel, which felt like a shield, Ethelgard felt like a display case. As they entered the Golden Gates, the sense hit Alara like a physical blow. There was no cedar, no lightning, no clean mountain air. Here, everything was perfumed. The wolves of the South smelled of sandalwood, expensive wine, and hidden daggers. "Keep your head up," Draven commanded softly through the mind link. "Nero is already packing. These alphas look soft, but they have the bite of vipers. Do not let them see you blink." "I'm not blinking, Draven," Alara replied, her hand grazing the hilt of the silver dagger he had gifted her. "I'm looking for the one who sent the maps to Sela's." The council chamber was a dome of glass and gold. In the center sat the 12 elders, the oldest alphas in the world. Some were so old their fur had turned ashen, their eyes clouded with cataracts, yet their auras were heavy, sluggish, and immense. At the center sat Elder Thorn Asterisk, a man who looked like he was carved from oak. He looked at Draven and Alara as they approached the center of the room. "Draven of the Black Spire," Thorn's voice was a low hum. "You were crowned to guard the wall, not to resurrect the dead." "I resurrected nothing," Draven said, his voice echoing in the vast chamber. "The Silver Wolf survived your purge. She is the North's heart, and she is my mate." A ripple of murmurs went through the gathered nobles. Mate. The word was a scandal in the South, where marriages were calculated for bloodline purity, not fated by the moon. "A mate is a private matter," Thorn countered. "The eclipse flame is a public threat. We have reports that you used a power that consumes the void and rewrites the physical world. This power is not in the books, Draven, and what is not in the books is dangerous." Thorn turned his gaze to Alara. "Step forward, girl. Let the elders see what the North calls a queen." Alara stepped forward. She didn't bow. She stood in the beam of sunlight hitting the center of the floor, her silver-blue gown shimmering. "My name is Alara," she said, her voice steady. "And the books you speak of were written by the men who tried to kill my ancestors. Perhaps it's time for a new chapter." "Insolence," one of the younger elders barked. "Is it insolence to survive?" Alara asked, her eyes beginning to glow with a faint, silver light. "Or is it insolence to watch a king almost die because his neighbors were too afraid to send aid?" Elder Thorn raised a hand, silencing the room. He looked at the eye of the moon on her chest. "You speak of survival," Thorn said, "but the South values stability. To prove you are not a threat, the Council demands a test. The labyrinth of the ancestors, asterisk. You and the king will enter. If you emerge with your souls intact, we will acknowledge your union. If you fail..." "They won't fail," Hector shouted from the sidelines. "The labyrinth is a death trap for the modern wolf." "If you fail," Thorn continued, ignoring him, "the North will be placed under a regency. The girl will be taken to the vaults for study, and Draven will be stripped of his crown." Draven stepped beside Alara, his hand finding hers. The eclipse flame flickered for a second between their palms, a spark of gray fire that made the elders flinch. "We accept," Draven said. "Draven, what are you doing?" Alara asked in his mind. "Hector says it's a trap." "It is," Draven replied, his eyes locked on Thorn. "But it's also the only place in this city where the Council can't follow us. In the labyrinth, there are no politics, only the wolf, and I'll take our chances with the wolf any day." As the guards moved to lead them toward the entrance of the labyrinth, a gaping maw of stone beneath the city, Alara saw a familiar figure in the crowd. "Hi, Lady Selene." She wasn't in chains. She was dressed in southern silk, standing behind Elder Thorn with a triumphant, wicked smile on her face. She hadn't been banished to the wastes. She had been recruited. The trap was set. The North had walked right into the heart of the spider's web. The labyrinth is a psychic and physical gauntlet. It doesn't test strength. It tests integrity asterisk. It strips away the masks of the participants, forcing them to face their deepest fears and their darkest secrets. For Draven and Alara, whose relationship is built on secrets and sudden power. The labyrinth will force them to answer a question. Do they love the person, or do they love the power? The entrance to the labyrinth was a jagged vertical slit in the earth, located beneath the roots of the Ethelgard sundial. As Alara and Draven stepped over the threshold, the warmth of the southern sun was instantly replaced by a damp, pressurized chill. The air didn't smell like the North. It smelled like the beginning of time, wet stone, ancient ozone, and the metallic tang of dried blood. The doors behind them didn't slam. They simply ceased to exist. Where there had been a staircase, there was now only a solid wall of weeping granite. "Draven!" Alara reached out, her fingers searching for his hand in the sudden, absolute dark. "I'm here," his voice rumbled, but it sounded miles away. She felt his hand slip into hers, but the sensation was wrong. His skin was cold, as smooth as marble, and as she squeezed, his fingers began to dissolve into sand. "Draven!" A flash of violet-white light erupted, and the ground beneath Alara gave way. She tumbled into a void that felt like falling through silk. When she finally hit the ground, she wasn't in a tunnel. She was back in the attic at Shadow Creek. The room was exactly as she remembered it. The sagging cot, the smell of dust and old grease, the single, cracked window that looked out onto the weeping willows. Elara stood in the center of the room, her regal midnight blue gown looking absurdly out of place. She looked down at her hands. They were covered in the gray grime of a servant. The eye of the moon asterisk was gone. Her chest felt light, hollow, and cold. "It's time for the floor's ghost." The voice made Alara's stomach turn. She turned to see Chloe standing in the doorway, but she wasn't the girl she remembered. Chloe was 10 feet tall, her eyes glowing with the same sickly green envy Alara had seen in Selene. "You thought you were a queen," Chloe laughed, the sound echoing like breaking glass. "You're just a coward who hid behind a king. Without his cloak, what are you? Without his blood, you're just the girl who let her mother burn." "Don't listen," Luna whispered, but the wolf's voice was faint, muffled by layers of gray cotton. "It's a trick of the labyrinth." "Is it?" Chloe stepped closer, her shadow swallowing the room. "The silver line died because they were too soft for this world. You survived because you were the softest of them all. You were so quiet even death forgot to find you." A mirror appeared on the wall. Elara looked into it and didn't see the Silver Queen. She saw the girl from the first night, the one with the muddy brown eyes, the one trembling in the corner of the carriage. "Draven doesn't love you," the mirror self whispered. "He loves the weapon. He loves the way you make him feel like a god. The moment the light fades, he'll drop you back into the mud." Elara felt the old, familiar weight of the silence pressing down on her. The urge to shrink, to apologize for existing, to hide her face was overwhelming. The labyrinth wasn't attacking her body. It was attacking the 10 years of trauma she had never actually healed. Miles away, or perhaps only inches, Draven stood in a field of bones. The sky was a bruised crimson, and the air was filled with the screams of a dying army. Thousands of black-armored warriors lay at his feet, their faces hidden behind their visors. Draven looked at his hands. They were dripping with silver blood. "You killed her," a voice whispered from the pile of bodies. Draven fell to his knees, frantically digging through the armor and bone until he found her. Elara lay there, her silver hair matted with blood, her eyes wide and lifeless. The eye of the moon on her chest was shattered. "I saved her," Draven roared at the empty sky. "I brought her home." "You brought her to a slaughterhouse," the voice of his father, the old king, echoed through the field. "The silver wolves were meant to stay in the stories. By dragging her into the light, you made her a target for the world. You didn't find a mate, Draven. You found a sacrifice." A group of southern elders appeared in the mist, their faces twisted into mocking smiles. "The Regency is established, Draven. The North is ours. And your queen, she's just another story we'll burn." Draven's wolf, Nero, lunged at the shadows, but there was nothing to bite. For every shadow he tore, 2 more emerged. The king of the North, the man who could dismantle mountains, was powerless against his own guilt. "She is the light," Nero growled, struggling to stay upright. "We are the shadow that protects it." "But the shadow is what defines the target," the labyrinth whispered back. "Without you, she would still be safe. Without you, she would still be a ghost. Why don't you let her go, Draven? Save her from yourself." In her attic, Elara stopped looking at the mirror. She looked at the grime on her hands. "You're right," she said to the giant Chloe. "I am a coward. I hid for 10 years. I let people think I was nothing." She stood up straight, her silver eyes beginning to bleed through the muddy brown. "But I didn't hide because I was weak. I hid because I was waiting." She reached into her chest, not for the eye, but for the spark that had always been there, even before the essence, even before Draven. The spark that had survived the fire that killed her mother. "I am Elara. I am the daughter of the moon, and my light doesn't come from a king's cloak." She slammed her hand against the mirror. The glass didn't break. It turned to light. The attic dissolved into a swirl of silver petals. At the same moment, in the field of bones, Draven stopped digging. He looked at the lifeless body of Elara and saw the truth. "She isn't mine to save," Draven whispered. "She is her own salvation." He stood up, his obsidian aura flaring with a new, quiet intensity. He didn't fight the shadows, he accepted them. He stepped into the darkness, and the field of bones vanished. The two paths converged in a central chamber. It was a small, circular room made of white quartz. In the center stood a single stone pedestal. Alara and Draven stepped into the room from opposite sides, their eyes meeting. They didn't run to each other. They stood still, seeing the truth of what the labyrinth had tried to do. On the pedestal lay a single, obsidian dagger and a silver bowl. A voice, neither male nor female, filled the room. To emerge, the blood must be balanced. One must give their power so the other may lead. The moon or the sun. Choose. Draven looked at the dagger, then at Alara. He reached for the hilt. Alara, the North needs a queen. If one of us has to be the relic for the council to be satisfied. No, Alara said, stepping forward. She took his hand, her fingers interlocked with his. That's what they want. They want us to choose one over the other. They want the sun to swallow the moon or the moon to eclipse the sun. She picked up the dagger, but she didn't point it at him or herself. She held it between them, her other hand still locked in his. We are the eclipse flame, she whispered. We don't choose. Together, they pressed their palms against the blade. Their blood, crimson and silver, flowed into the silver bowl at the same time. The labyrinth didn't scream. It opened. The quartz walls shattered, and the sunlight of Ethelgard flooded in. But they weren't in the council chamber. They were standing atop the great sundial, in front of the entire city. The elders stood below them, their mouths open in shock. No one had ever emerged from the labyrinth in minutes. No one had ever emerged asterisk together. But it wasn't just that they had escaped. As they stood there, hand in hand, the eclipse flame erupted between them, soaring into the sky like a gray phoenix. The light of the sundial was swallowed by their shadow, and the shadows of the city were illuminated by their light. Alara looked down at Elder Thorn. Her silver eyes were terrifying in their clarity. The test is over, Alara announced, her voice echoing through the streets of the south. Now let's talk about the regency. Behind Thorn, Seleni's face turned from triumph to a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. Because standing next to the Silver Queen wasn't just a king. It was a man who had finally stopped being afraid of the dark. By refusing to choose, Alara and Draven have bypassed the sacrifice protocol of the elders. They have proven that their bond is not one of master and servant, but of true equals. This has never happened in the recorded history of the great houses. The atmosphere atop the great sundial was no longer one of a trial. It was a coronation of a power the South could not categorize. The gray fire of the eclipse flame licked at the sky, casting a strange, ethereal twilight over the white stone city of Ethelgard. Elder Thorn stood paralyzed. He had sent them into the labyrinth to break them, to force a choice that would leave one of them subservient and the other a puppet of the council. Instead, they had emerged as a singular, unbreakable front. The Regency, Thorn stammered, his oak-like composure splintering. The law states. The law was written by those who feared what they could not control, Alara interrupted. She stepped to the edge of the sundial, her voice amplified by the resonant quartz beneath her feet. You call me an anomaly. You call the king a renegade. But while you sat in your golden chairs, the void was at your gates. The North didn't just protect its own borders, it protected yours. She turned her gaze to the crowd of Southern alphas. How many of you knew Silas was a traitor? She asked. How many of you held the maps while the Shadowhounds gathered? Silence is not stability, elders, it is complicity. Draven stepped forward, his obsidian presence a heavy anchor beside her light. He didn't draw his sword. He didn't need to. The way he looked at Thorn made the elder take a step back. We didn't come here to be judged by you, Draven said, his voice a low rumble that traveled through the stone. We came to give you a choice. You can acknowledge the sovereignty of the North and the return of the Silver Line, or you can watch as the eclipse flame cleanses this city of its rot. You threaten the High Council, a Southern alpha from the front row shouted, drawing a golden-hilted dagger. In the heart of Ethelgard. Before the man could even level his weapon, Alara raised her hand. She didn't use the flare. She used the asterisk binding of the moon. Silver threads, invisible until they touched the skin, erupted from the air itself. They wrapped around the alpha's wrists, pinning his arms to his sides with the weight of the tides. The golden dagger fell, clattering harmlessly to the ground. "I don't threaten," Alara said, her eyes turning a cold, luminescent silver. "I reveal." Lady Selene stepped forward. The crowd parted as if sliced by a blade. Selene, who had been trying to blend into the shadows behind the council, froze. The silver threads found her too, gently but firmly pulling her into the center of the sundial. "You told the council that Draven was bewitched," Alara said, walking a slow circle around the trembling woman. "You told them I was a weapon the king intended to use to conquer the south. You even offered to be the stable hand on the northern throne once we were removed." "It's the truth," Selene shrieked, looking at Thorn. "Look at her, look at that power, it's not natural." "Natural is a word used by the blind," Alara countered. She reached out and touched Selene's forehead. A projection of light blossomed in the air above them, a memory pulled directly from Selene's mind. The council watched in horrified silence as they saw the image of Selene meeting with the Grand Inquisitor's crow, handing over the secret passcodes to the Citadel's volcanic vents. The betrayal was no longer a rumor, it was a vision. The outrage was instantaneous. The Southern Alphas, prideful as they were, could not stomach a traitor who had dealt with the void. "Seize her," Thorn commanded, his voice cracking. As the guards dragged Selene away, this time to the deepest pits of the southern vaults, Thorn turned back to Draven and Alara. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a weary, calculating respect. "You have cleared your names of the charge of conspiracy," Thorn conceded, "but the power you wield, the Eclipse flame, it still breaks the Continental Accord. The world cannot have two suns, Draven." "Then let it have a moon and a shadow," Alara said. She reached into the asterisk eye of the moon asterisk on her chest. The liquid mercury began to flow, but instead of forming a shield, it spread across the surface of the great sundial. It filled the carved grooves of the ancient clock, turning the gold to silver. "I am establishing a new accord," Alara announced. "The silver line will not rule the south, but we will no longer be hunted by it. The north is a sanctuary. Any wolf, alpha, beta, or omega who is cast out for their weakness or their blood will find a home with us." "You are creating a splinter kingdom," an elder whispered. "No," Draven said, his hand resting on Alara's shoulder. "We are creating a future. The Order of the Eclipse was only the first shadow. There are others coming. When the dark returns, and it will, you won't be calling for a tribunal. You'll be calling for us." Draven looked at Alara, a soft, private smile breaking through his stern mask. He leaned in, his voice for her alone. "Ready to go home, little ghost?" "I'm already home," she replied, her heart finally still. They left Ethelgard that evening, not as prisoners, but as a legend. As they crossed back over the border into the northern territories, the first snow of the season began to fall. The flakes weren't just white. In the presence of the king and queen, they seemed to catch a hint of silver light. They reached the gates of the citadel at dawn. The iron phalanx was there, their black armor dusted with white. Marcus stepped forward, bowing lower than he ever had before. "Welcome back, your majesties," he said. Alara dismounted, her boots crunching in the fresh snow. She looked up at the black spire, the fortress that had been her prison, her battlefield, and now her home. She wasn't the girl from the attic anymore. She was the Silver Queen, the bridge between the stars and the stone. And as she walked through the gates by Draven's side, she knew the road ahead would be filled with more wars and more shadows. But for the first time in 10 years, she wasn't afraid of the dark, because she knew that the moon only shines brightest when the world is at its blackest.